Hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about the Boy Scouts of America. Pretty interesting story. But before I get started, I'd like to tell you something about what's going to be ahead. There are going to be some explicit details coming ahead. Some listeners may find this material disturbing. Please listen with caution. Well, I was starting to look into the Boy Scouts of America because they just had a big settlement happen. Well, it's still in the process of happening over, well, abuse of boys. And, not such a simple story. Turns out the royals and the church were supportive of the Boy Scouts from the very beginning. It was created by a man in the UK who loved Peter Pan. You know, Peter Pan? I'll be getting to that in a bit. So, the man who started the Boy Scouts over in the UK loved Peter Pan. And the Boy Scouts were strongly supported by the church and the royalty. So we have a direct connection there with how these Boy Scouts got started. Seems like a pretty, well, it seemed like a straightforward case to me until I got involved in it. Because, Peter Pan, well, Pan is one of their gods, and Peter Pan is part of that whole thing. And interestingly enough, in this case, normally they deny it. No, that's not one of our symbols. No, we don't like those symbols. Well, yeah, just like those iron crosses. Yeah, that's how I tracked a lot of them. They love those symbols, and Peter Pan is one of them. Pan is their pan god, and a very disturbing story will unfold in this whole thing with the Boy Scouts. But before I get started, which ties into this, in the entryway to the house in that Epstein had the Zorro Ranch over there, and the Zorro Ranch, never got searched and all that kind of stuff. Nothing to see here, right? So anyway, so right there at the entrance is this huge, huge painting or print or whatever. It's called The Massacre of the Innocents. And that comes from the Gospel of Matthew 2:16 to 18 in the New Testament. And what is it? Well, it's a painting of Herod the Great killing male infants in Bethlehem. So the motivation was supposedly to eliminate the prophesied king of the Jews, meaning Jesus. And it's one of the earliest narratives of state directed violence against children. So, and the subject matter is among the most disturbing in Western art. Well, two ways to look at things. We're living in an inverted world. Mask of the Innocents is historically a warning about power abusing the most vulnerable. Well, I would have to say it is likely inverted, right? It is a depiction of power being exercised over the vulnerable, is how I would see that picture. Well, that's how they interpret it in their own Bible, right? And this story, it's really a twisted one. The boys are the ones getting raped. The girls got assigned to sell cookies. But the Boy Scout of America has agreed to pay victims, but only part of the story. The real part is how this whole thing got started. The church and the royals set up the original Boy Scouts in the UK. I'd like to give you a few statistics. We seem to be getting all these things wrong, and I'm not sure about all these numbers, so let's tread lightly on the numbers because people like Rain and all those people are the ones coming up with these numbers. But most of child abuse is an inside job, okay? 85% of child sexual abuse is committed by someone the child knows, family members, relatives, family friends, or caregivers. So that could break down to 30 to 40% being immediate family, parent, step parent, siblings. So the other 40 to 50% would be trusted circle, family friends, babysitters, neighbors, Boy Scout troops, partners of the parents. So I think what they're saying statistically is 70 to 90% occurs in what you'd call the home ecosystem. So, and that is likely the reason why they came up with all that stranger danger business, right? Oh, there's danger everywhere. Let's put it on milk cartons and let's warn the people. Let's warn that all the strangers are going to grab their kids. All we've ever heard about is stranger danger, which I'm here to say Likely a really big misdirection because stranger danger isn't as dangerous as the danger within a child's home. So, how did we get here? Well, children talk. I watched a million shows about abuse victims talking about how they got roped into all of this and how they got, well, actually, tricking a child is exactly what it is. Tricking a child, very easy. Child's play, they might say, right? Anybody could trick a child. It doesn't take a hero, it doesn't take a smart person. All it takes is a psychopath, right? Somebody who is lacking in compassion, somebody who has no empathy. So it got started in a very interesting way because this is a game of omission, right? All these kids that I've been listening to, they all talk about they did not have the words to say what was going on with them. They didn't have a clue. Nobody had told them about any of this stuff. Well, how did that happen? Well, let's get back to the root of it all. Many youth organizations like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, they emphasize moral purity. It also avoided explicit sex education, which meant children had less language to report abuse. Adults had more power to control the narrative. This pattern shows up repeatedly in institution abuse investigations. Children in clubs, church programs, and youth organizations historically receive little or no sex education, and that gap is frequently cited in survivor testimony and investigations. And this whole thing with the Boy Scouts of America is like that deal with the Indians and the uranium mines. It has unleashed so much paperwork that I'm just like trying to figure out how to get my way through it all. The key issue is that sex education is usually delivered through schools. Pay attention to this, okay? So they're claiming sex education is usually delivered through schools. While many abuse cases occur in extracurriculum or religious environments where that education is not provided. So there's a big assumption going on here. I think parents believe that sex education is being taught in the schools, okay? But a lot of the abuse is happening in extracurricular or religious environments where nothing is being taught, right? So youth organizations rarely teach sex education. Now, isn't that convenient? Programs such as Boy Scouts of America, Girl Scouts of the USA, church youth ministries, and sport leagues generally do not teach sex education. Instead, they focus on leadership, religion or moral instruction, outdoor activities, or athletics. Even organizations that include health badges or life skills training typically avoid explicit sexual education topics. Many church youth programs emphasize moral teachings rather than biological education. For example, one huge player in this Boy Scouts of America is the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints. Yeah, all these churches were really big in this deal and still are. So here's what happens. Like, for example, the Church of Jesus of Latter-day Saints youth instruction emphasizes chastity and modesty. Catholic youth programs historically emphasize abstinence and purity. Youth ministries often focus on abstinence pledges. So, in many of these settings, anatomical language may be avoided. Explicit sexual discussions are actually discouraged. Many youth organizations rely on adult authority figures and trust based environments. Children are often taught respect your leaders, obey the adults, trust the mentors. Psychologists studying abuse cases note that these structures can make it harder for children to recognize or report misconduct. Explicit teaching about abuse recognition only became common after the late 20th century, and it's really not even what I would consider common. A major turning point in the United States was the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. I would argue not that long ago, which led to mandatory reporting systems and increased awareness. So up until 1974, you were on your own. If your parents didn't teach you, no one was teaching you, and you were on your own as a small child. Even after that, many youth organizations did not adopt formal abuse prevention training until the 1990s to 2010s. Here again, not that long ago. And that doesn't mean that when they came up with things in the 20s, 1990s, and the 2010s, that doesn't mean that everybody was on board with everything, right? There's a lot of lag going on here, right? So even when children learn basic sex education in school, they may not connect that knowledge to abuse situations. Researchers studying institutional abuse cases found that children often believed the adult was teaching them something. It was part of a game or special attention. They would get into trouble if they told anyone. This confusion appears frequently in testimony from survivors connected to organizations such as the Boy Scouts of America and religious institutions. So, historically, schools provided limited, and I mean limited, sex education, like, calling things private parts, using coded languages. Youth organizations provided almost none. Church settings often avoided sexual discussions entirely. That combination meant many children lacked the vocabulary and conceptual framework to identify abuse, which is why survivors often say they did not understand what was happening at the time. Unlike many countries, the United States still does not require nationwide sex education. About half of U.S. states, half require sex education. Fewer require it to be medically accurate, talking about, this part, not the actual part, but, just pointing at things on a graph and coming up with make believe words. And many allow parents to opt the children out. In some areas, students may receive little or no instruction at all. Even when sex education is taught, and this is where the trap door lies, it often begins, and listen to this, after the age when many abuse cases occur. So, very conveniently, they start the sex education after the ages when many abuse cases occur. People are making big assumptions. They're assuming that schools cover it. Parents often assume that modern schools provide comprehensive sexual education. But reality is not there. Programs vary widely by state or region. Some schools teach only abstinence. Others provide only basic reproductive biology. Because parents believe it is already being covered, they may not address it themselves. Across many institutional scandals, investigators frequently see a similar pattern. Authority institutions define the language, just like they did with the word psychopaths. If people realized the extent of evil that now surrounds us, I think they would handle their children a whole lot differently. But without any kind of warnings from any kind of government, schools, or anybody, people are tooling along and thinking, hey, what are these people talking about evil? Evil doesn't exist in most people's minds. And that is exactly why they also hid the word psychopaths. If you hide it, they're not going to know about it, right? No one's going to say, hey, I think my teacher is a psychopath because they show no emotion, no human ability to capture things the way the rest of us do. They did not even have that language about sex the same way did not have the language about psychopaths, and outsiders hesitate to question the experts. Problems are recognized only after large investigations. And here's some really crazy timing. Puberty lessons get taught in grades 5 to 7. Reproductive education gets taught in middle school or high school. However, many abuse survivors report incidents occurring at ages 6 to 12 and sometimes younger. So children may experience abuse before they ever receive formal sex education. Now, isn't this timing very convenient? It is timed almost exactly to make sure that it does not work. At least that is how I'm seeing it, right? Historically, sex education focused on reproduction, puberty, pregnancy, and disease. Even if children had some biological knowledge, they often did not connect that knowledge to abuse by a trusted adult. They are children, they are not many adults. Many youth organizations rely on adult authority figures and trust based environments. And that's where it comes in. The children are taught respect those leaders, obey the adults, and trust all the mentors. All of this makes it so much harder for children to recognize they're being told on one hand, hey, trust all these people. They're all fine. There are experts. There are leaders. And it took them until 1974 to come up with the first thing to try to protect these children. And the children all say the exact same thing. Children deal through fantasy. These are games, right? That's where Peter Pan will come into this in a bit here. They see things in sort of a magical sense, right? And it's easy to tell a child, we're going to get you in trouble if you tell anybody. Well, because you've already set them up, right? You told them these are authority figures. You told them these are experts. You told them they must be respected. And then, so you really think the kids are going to then go and report those same people? And even the brave kids that try to report them, they get shut down immediately. So that combination meant many children lack the vocabulary and conceptual framework to even identify abuse because of all of these trusted figures. And then in the religious environments, these sexual topics were taboo, and children naturally fear punishment. So that's why they interpret behavior as a game. They believe adults are always right. They fear getting into trouble. And this deal with the LDS church is really something else. The entire youth structure for boys in the LDS church was integrated with the Boy Scouts of America. This created one of the clearest real world overlaps between religious authority, scouting structure, and centralized control. Because Boy Scouts of America feels like an extension of church abuse, if you ask me. They were so intermingled together that made this lawsuit even harder because of all of the intermingling between these churches and the Boy Scouts of America. Because for much of the 20th century, a majority of Boy Scouts of America units were operated through churches, meaning the two systems were interlocked at the operational level, even if not centrally controlled. So historically, 2/3 to 3/4 of all Boy Scout units were church sponsored. Today, it's closer to 40%. So the churches sponsored the Boy Scouts of America. So these meetings were being held on church property. You see where this is starting to go? If people are murdering each other at the rates they keep raping children, it would be in the newspapers every day, wouldn't it? When children come forward and start talking, there's fear about what's going to happen when the abuse is publicized. In many parts of Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, a large share of schools are run by religious organizations. Catholic schools in countries such as the Philippines, Kenya, and Uganda, Protestant churches across Latin America, Islamic madras systems in countries such as Pakistan or Indonesia, and those madras systems are just as filthy and as bad. And in all of these schools, sex education is often abstinence focused. Detailed information about sexual autonomy or consent may be limited or actually avoided. Abuse prevention is sometimes not explicitly discussed. So, in practice, religious doctrine often shapes what children are allowed to learn. So, in many places, the practical result is this: the children get a short lesson on puberty. They get little discussion of consent or abuse, and there's no open discussion of sexuality. This is one of the reasons survivors in many countries report not knowing the words for body parts, not understanding what abuse was, thinking it was normal or their fault. So, historically, explicit child protection education is relatively recent everywhere, not just in developing countries. I think we have a huge, I'm talking a monstrous problem on our hands. And I think this is a problem of world events that everybody should be perking up their ears over. These children are being set up to be abused, is how I'm seeing all this. I hope you're following along here. Explicit lessons teaching children correct names for body parts, good touch, bad touch, or how to report abuse mostly began appearing in school curriculum in the 1980s to 1990s in many countries. So, up until that point, they weren't even given the correct names for the body part. They're just talked about, oh, this private part here. They weren't given the names. They weren't taught about good touch or bad touch. They weren't even taught about how to report the abuse until close to the 1990s. Before that period, many adults simply did not imagine teaching, excuse me, before that period, many adults simply did not imagine teaching young children about sexual abuse directly. Psychologists use the term betrayal trauma to describe abuse that occurs inside systems a child was taught to trust. So that's called betrayal trauma. Places such as schools, youth organizations, churches, sports groups, and scouting groups. The concept was developed by psychologist Jennifer Fried. The key element is that the harm involves a violation of trust by caregivers or institutions that were supposed to protect the child. Talk about an inversion. The people that are supposed to check the child do not take care of the children, right? Many survivors later say the hardest part was not just the abuse itself, but realizing the system failed them. When survivors learn more about the history of how organizations handled abuse, their focus often shifts, I didn't say shifts, shifts, from one bad person hurt me to the institution allowed it to happen. This is why many modern lawsuits target organizations, not just individual offenders. We have the Boy Scouts of America, the Catholic Church, and sports organizations such as those involved in the Larry Nassar case. Many survivors grew up believing their experience was rare or unique. When large investigations or lawsuits reveal thousands of victims, survivors sometimes experience validation. It wasn't just me. Anger. They knew this was happening. And grief over the scale of the problem. The release of internal documents, such as the Boy Scouts ineligible volunteer files, had exactly this effect for many Survivors. The Boy Scouts were keeping records from the very beginning. The records had several names. One was the ineligible volunteer files, and I'll have much more about that later. The setup is long and pretty evil, if you ask me. So, survivors respond in very different ways. Common feelings reported: anger, betrayal, grief, validation, and relief when the truth becomes public. There isn't just a single reaction. And one comment was, if someone had explained to me what was happening, I might have understood it wasn't my fault. And that is the key here. That is where the shame comes in. If you can convince other people that it was their fault, you can then put them into a victim thing of shame that will guide and control them for the rest of their lives if they don't understand how they got there. So if someone had explained to me what was happening, I might have understood it wasn't my fault. That statement says it all. The absence of language and awareness that might have helped children recognize and report abuse sooner. So, when did they really know about this abuse in these Boy Scouts? Well, funny you should ask. 1910 to 1920, literally about the time the Boy Scouts was getting started, they already had a system in place to hide the abuse. The Boy Scouts created what later became known as the ineligible volunteer files to track suspected abusive leaders, to quietly remove them from troops. However, most were not reported to police. Many were simply moved to other communities. Starting to sound like the church to you? Certainly sounds like it to me. And I'm going to interject my own thoughts here for a second here. I don't think everybody was put on the list, okay? I think the people running the thing never got put on those lists. Just something to think about, okay? These people controlled lists of who was abusing these boys. Do you think they put their own names on these lists or just chumps that they happened to catch and they put on the list because they had to keep things quiet, right? So I think there are probably, well, they probably didn't put themselves on a list, but yeah, there was in fact a list. So let's hammer this back to the beginning. The scouting movement was founded in Britain. Good morning, London. Top of the morning to you over there. In 1907 by Robert Baden-Powell, a British army officer who became a national hero during the siege of Mafeking. That's Mafeking. Yeah, he did something good. So everybody, oh, this Robert Baden-Powell is a hero. Well, he's also an elite, okay? So after returning from the war, Baden-Powell, who has a hyphenated name, which I'll get into later, wrote Scouting for Boys, a handbook that turned military scouting skills, tracking, signaling, camping, and observation into activities for boys. The idea spread rapidly across Britain and the British Empire with strong public support. Listen up. From the monarchy, including King Edward VII, who encouraged Baden-Powell to devote himself full-time to youth scouting. So they expanded to the United States. Inspired by the British movement, the Boy Scouts of America was created in 1910. The American organization had backed, excuse me, let me start over. The American organization, in other words, the Boy Scouts of America, had backing from powerful civic and business leaders, including publisher William D. Boyce, who helped formalize the program in the United States. Within a few years, scouting spread nationwide through schools, churches, and civic groups. During World War I and World War II, scouts in several countries assisted national war efforts. Boys were not soldiers, but they were commonly used for delivering messages and communications, assisting civil defense, helping with first aid emergency services, collecting scrap metal and war materials. In occupied Europe, some former scouts later joined underground resistance movements because they already knew skills like signaling, navigation, and covert communication. After World War II, scouting organizations increasingly promoted themselves as movements for peace, citizenship, and moral development rather than military preparation. In the United States, especially, the Boy Scouts of America became deeply tied to churches, which sponsored many local troops, civic organizations, school and community groups. By the late 20th century, roughly two-thirds of Boy Scouts of America, I'm just going to call them BSA troops, were sponsored by religious institutions. So two-thirds were sponsored by religion, making scouting closely connected to church networks within the country, all across the country. In short, BSA was founded in Britain by Baden-Powell in 1907. It spread internationally with royal and elite support. It was adopted in the U.S. as the Boy Scouts of America in 1910. Scouts assisted national efforts during the World Wars. And of course, after World War II, they switched it around. Well, we're going to be about peace now. We're going to be about citizenship and youth development with strong support from church and civics groups. In a show I did recently about NATO and psychopaths, I said that Robert Hare, who is the world's leading so called expert on psychopaths, Robert Hare, in my mind, was a world class gatekeeper. This man, Baden Powell, who started the Boy Scouts, is, in my opinion, a world class groomer of boys. That is the premise that I'm coming from. So, I'm going to take a break here and I'm going to cover a couple of these things that happen in the news. Why I have them down here, I don't know. I just forgot to move them. Trump recently, the U.S. recently killed at least 175 kids striking a school in Iran. I'm telling you for the once and last time, this is about a kill box. They don't care if they killed a bunch of kids in a school. The lethal strike on this elementary school was a result of a targeting error by the U.S. military, which mistook the facility for part of an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy base that was adjacent to the school. They do not care. Let me take you back to the beginning. There was a time, there was a General Clark, he's still around. General Clark told this person, Goodman, that he went back to see the same general a few weeks later. And by that time, we were bombing in Afghanistan. Clark said he asked if the U.S. was still planning to go to war with Iraq. He said, "Oh, it's worse than that." The general then handed Clark a piece of paper that came from the Secretary of Defense's office. Clark told Goodman, the general then said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finish off Iran," according to Clark. So that is the operating goal here. It has nothing to do. People are spending all their time, oh, this was a big mistake. Why did the United States do that? If you are engaged in all of that, you're wasting your time. And then they say on social media, well, we're going to get them in the next election. Wakey, wakey, kids. I don't think there's going to be a next election. They're already telling Americans to accept higher gas prices. This is a kill box, and gas prices to cripple the working class further with higher food and transport is what is coming down the road. And because this is about children, let me tell you something they're doing with all these photos with children. Billionaire financier Leon Black, the private equity firm Apollo Global Management, and the massive school photography company called Lifetouch. So, the billionaire financier Leon Black, who's in all of the Epstein files, he is involved or was involved with a massive school photography company called Lifetouch that takes the majority of school pictures in the United States. So if you're sitting there thinking, "Well, I want to do something. I'm tired of all this happening to the kiddos." Well, then do something. Stop sitting and listening to people pontificating. They're just blowing up smoke right now, telling you, "Well, we can't stop this Iran thing. We're going to have to wait till the next election." Yeah, okay, just wait till the next election, see what happens, right? So you're going to think, why is she talking about Leon Black? Well, let me tell you here in a second. Not only does he own the company that takes pictures of most of the children, I don't think they have all of our data, and I've been saying this for years. That's why they did those DNA kits and stuff. They do not have everything people think they have. They do not have this massive thing that they're claiming they have, right? Leon Black is a billionaire investor and co founder of Apollo Global Management, one of the largest private equity firms in the world. He stepped down in 2021 after scrutiny over payments he made to Jeffrey Epstein for financial advice. Black paid Epstein around 158 million for tax and estate planning services over several years. So, Leon Black, a pretty dirty guy, right? And so, let's talk about the photo company. Lifetouch is one of the largest school photography companies in North America. It photographs about 25 million students a year in more than 50,000 schools. It produces school portraits, class photos, and many yearbooks. Lifetouch is also owned by Shutterfly, which was purchased in 2019 by Apollo, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so Leon Black shows up taking pictures, showing in the Epstein files, and now he's showing pictures. He's owning a company that takes pictures of children. Okay, so people have been having some backlash. In Texas, districts canceled the school photo days. Michigan schools paused the picture day while reviewing the situation. Arkansas districts ended contracts with Lifetouch. Parents contacted schools saying they were uncomfortable with the company photographing their children. Gee, you think so? And so that now Life Touch is saying, "Well, we don't have any connection. We don't have any connection." Well, they all connect. If you remember, just a few years ago, YouTube got in trouble between them and the New York Times over all of the pedophiles and pictures over children. If you think putting your pictures of your children online is a good idea, it has always been a very bad idea. It has never once been a good idea. Never once in the history of this world in the internet has putting your children's picture online, the people you claim to be the most valuable in your whole life, to put those little people's pictures online is a big, big mistake because the school photography market used to be regional. And then, of course, according to the private equity, it became global all over the United States, right? And Lifetouch absorbed many competitors over decades, giving it enormous reach. And there's, of course, facial recognition programs. They don't have facial recognition the way they say they have it. But if you keep giving them access to your children and your photos, they're going to have it soon enough, right? So, a small number of school districts have experimented with facial recognition security tools already. There's a big case. The system compared faces captured by security cameras against a database of student and staff photos. So there's a lot going on with these photos, right? Parents do not realize how broadly the photos may be used beyond portrait sales. Questions about how long student images remain stored. Photography companies and software vendors may both interact with the images. So you could be setting your kid up for misidentification if they're using these pictures for moving forward to put us all on some sort of facial recognition. Well, I would say that it is a very bad, bad idea to keep your pictures out there. You may want to try to look. I've been online since 1994, okay? Go look for a picture of me. Go ahead, keep looking. You will find one picture of me online, one in all of these years since 1994. And I actually started sharing my work online. May have been my dumbest move. It was leading to my death, but I started sharing my work online going on 9 years next month and still one picture of me. Okay. And there's also these case of the Dubins. This also came out of the Epstein file. Just something that I'm not going to go through everything that's coming out of these files because most of these people are using a lot of it for clickbait. But here's one I want you to pay attention to. When you let your children out of your own eyesight, you don't know what they're doing now, do you? So somebody said, I would say there were a couple of people that were talking about these different things they found in the files. And this is what they said. I would say the Dubins are number two. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Glenn and Eva Dubin, Dubin, were really close friend of Epstein's. One of the emails that was honestly haunting me the most was one that Eva Dubin and sent Epstein after he was already a convicted sex offender. She mailed she emailed Epstein that her teenage daughter was having 5 friends over the next week and that he should come by. That was him. Wow. Okay. So Dubin is a billionaire hedge fund manager who has donated to Democrats. Just when we're talking about the bipartisan nature of this and why this was not revealed. So, Eva Dubin is a doctor, very high up and very powerful at Mount Sinai. And Epstein had some privileges at these hospitals because of her. She and her husband started the Dubin Breast Center at Mount Sinai because they were these billionaire donors. Epstein had special access to Mount Sinai doctors who would treat the girls he would come stay with him. They helped him get ambulances for his island and his ranch in New Mexico and just all of this special access. He had a VIP line to the hospital and all of these privileges because of his contacts with these billionaires. This is where, when we talk about why billionaires prefer philanthropy, it's more than vanity. I used to think it was just vanity or a tax strategy that they give money because it's less than they would be taxed. But it's more than that. It's special privileges. For example, if you donate a wing to a hospital, then the girls that are being trafficked and abused can get medical attention there. Seeing the people and institutions, hospitals, universities that were part of his and giving him this kind of acceptance, even though he was a convicted sex trafficker, was really shocking to us. There were so many people involved. Yeah, and that's where they're coming up with all this transhumanism. So, yeah, they're using hospitals and they're using doctors and all these feed into this. And it is one big connected outlet, and that they want to make money off of your children's pictures. So I'm going to have to put this on hold and take a break here for a second. Okay, one last thing about these pictures and all this stuff online is just remember all those DNA kits, those were all kind of fake, right? They've been trying to gather data for a very long time. Stop feeding them. Okay, back to the subject at hand. So the files that they had were often called the perversion files or ineligible volunteer files. So they came under two names, either perversion files or ineligible volunteer files. Were internal records maintained by the Boy Scouts of America. They documented adults who were barred from participation in scouting because of suspected misconduct, including sexual abuse. So, where were these files stored? Well, for most of their existence, the files were kept at the BSA or Boy Scouts of America National Headquarters. In the beginning, they were kept at their New York headquarters. Then later, they were moved to their Irving, Texas national office. Local councils usually sent reports to the national office, which decided whether to place a person in the IV file system. The files were physical paper records for most of the 20th century and were later partially digitized. So, who could access these files? Well, they were typically limited to national BSA executives, the legal department staff, or selected risk management personnel, or on rare occasions, law enforcement. In many cases, the councils were informed that a person was ineligible, but the details of the allegations were not widely shared. This limited disclosure became one of the major criticisms in later lawsuits. Entries often included, so what was in these files? Well, letters from local scout leaders reporting concerns, internal memos about suspected misconduct, witness statements, and if there was any correspondence with police, and decisions about banning the individual. However, the files did not always mean the person was reported to law enforcement. In many cases, the response was simply remove the volunteer, mark them ineligible, keep the record internally. The existence of the files became widely known after litigation in the 1980s and 1990s. A major moment came in 2012 when a Oregon court ordered thousands of documents released in the case of Doe versus Boy Scouts of America. That release exposed thousands of internal abuse records, records dating back to the 1920s. So, did scouts in other countries use the same system? Well, not exactly. The Boy Scouts of America is only one member organization of the global scouting movement overseen by the World Organization of the Scout Movement. Each national scouting body operates independently. For example, they have the Scout Association for the UK or Scouts Canada. These organizations had their own disciplinary systems. Some kept internal records of banned volunteers, but there was no universal global file system like the BSA had with the IV files. So, information sharing between countries was limited. Banned volunteers in one country could sometimes move elsewhere without the same restrictions. Critics argued the system showed the organizations knew about many suspected offenders but handled them internally. Offenders were sometimes removed quietly rather than reported. Records were not shared widely enough to prevent re entry. Lack of transparency with parents or the public. Supporters of the system argued the files were intended to prevent known offenders from volunteering again. But the debate over whether they were used effectively became central to later lawsuits. So the IV files show that the organization maintained internal records of suspected predators for decades, but the restricted access and limited reporting practices became one of the central issues during the litigation. In the In the ineligible volunteer files or the IV files maintained by the Boy Scouts of America, relocation or quiet removal of a suspected offender usually appeared indirectly in correspondence and administrative notes rather than in a formal category labeled relocation. The files were essentially case folders, and they contained letters between local scout councils and the national office. When a person was moved, resigned, or quietly removed, it tended to show up in several recognizable patterns. One common notation in the files was language such as volunteer has resigned, registration not renewed, leader removed from position. This meant the individual was no longer active in that troop or council. However, the record often did not clearly state why in the summary line. The detailed letters inside the file sometimes contained the actual allegation. When a leader moved to another region, files sometimes contained letters like, well, a council asking the national office if a person was eligible. National staff responding that the individual was ineligible for registration. And some patterns in the records: complaint from local troops. Council informs national office. So these letters sometimes reveal that the person attempted to register elsewhere. In some files, the national office sent letters to councils marked confidential or do not register this individual. The letter might say the person had been barred from scouting, but often avoided explicit description of the allegations. Relocation sometimes appeared in notes indicating the person moved to another city or state. The council lost contact. The leader transferred to another troop. The files sometimes included follow up letters asking whether the person had reappeared in scouting elsewhere. Another important detail historians found in the IV files: some folders show investigations that ended without a ban. Reasons included lack of proof, offender leaving before action taken, or concern about defamation liability. In those cases, the file might simply state that the individual left scouting. So they looked for patterns like repeated registrations in different councils, correspondence between councils about the same person, notes showing a volunteer leaving one troop immediately after allegations. These patterns suggested that in some situations, offenders left quietly rather than being publicly reported. The IV system was originally intended as a central blacklist to prevent known offenders from registering again. If someone on the list attempted to volunteer, their registration should be rejected by the national office. However, the effectiveness depended on councils reporting the allegations, accurate identification of the individual, and the offender attempting to re register. So, relocation in the files usually appears through administrative language: resigned, moved, not re registered, and letters between councils rather than an explicit note saying someone was transferred after abuse. Researchers had to piece together these movements by reading the entire correspondence chain inside each file. So, of course, like all good people, the Boy Scouts of America exploded during bankruptcy proceedings in 2020 to 2022. So, bankruptcy proceedings, always the way they take it, right? And from the court filings, about 82,000, no, excuse me, about 82,000 men filed abuse claims in the bankruptcy process. They were expecting about 8 or 9,000, but 80,000 of them or more Abuse reports dating back to the 1910s. Internal files documented suspected abuse for decades. So they became known as the ineligible volunteer files, sometimes called the perversion files. So what came out of this? Well, in 2022, there was a settlement, $2.4 billion to compensate survivors. And there are a million issues with this settlement. So there's a lot of issues. The main issue is this: people are not getting paid. The victims are not getting payouts. But of course, the lawyers have all gotten paid out, right? Lawyers on all sides, bankruptcy lawyers and survivor attorneys, have already been paid or are collecting fees, often hundreds of millions collectively, while many survivors are still waiting for full compensation. Yeah, they've been giving the survivors like, oh, like 1 or 2%. And when you go and you read any of these cases, keep one thing in mind, like the Oregon case. Oh, they got him for $20 million. Well, that is just the first thing you're going to hear, right? Well, that goes up on appeals, and that $20 million may become like, I don't know, 10, $12 million. So if you read about a big number, do the due diligence and track it down. It does not end up being that same amount of money. So, so the lawyers and stuff are all getting paid, right? The chartered organization system is one of the most important and least understood parts of how the Boy Scouts of America operated for more than a century. It also explains why churches became deeply tied to the program. So, the Boy Scouts did not usually run local troops directly. Instead, they licensed the program to outside institutions called chartered organizations. Typical charter partners included the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Roman Catholic Church, United Methodist Church, and civic groups like the Rotary, the Lions Clubs, and schools. By the 2000s, about 70% of Scout units were sponsored by religious institutions. Each year, the church or sponsor signed a charter agreement with the Boy Scouts. Under the agreement, the church agreed to own and operate the troop, select the adult leaders, provide meeting space, supervise the local programs, and the Boy Scouts national organizations provided the program materials, training manuals, uniforms and branding, insurance coverage, and background checks in later years. So legally, the troop was often technically run by the church, not the national organization. Let's talk a little bit about the main group, these Jesus Christ LDS people. You know, they got my attention, right? Joseph Smith, who started the group. Well, just like that, Mohammed having sex with young kids or marrying that young girl, right? Married her at 4, sex at 6. What was it? Or married at 6, sex at 9? I can't remember. So confusing, right? These LDS people have the same kind of deal going on. Joseph Smith and plural marriages, secret plural marriages. Between roughly 1831 and 1844, Joseph Smith married dozens of women in addition to his legal wife, Emma Smith. Most historians estimate 30 to 40 plural wives. The practice was kept secret from the public and many church members. Some marriages were presented as religious commandments revealed by God. And if you're asking yourself, well, why is she talking about the LDS church in the middle of all this? Because we need to understand the character of these people. The LDS church was responsible for about 30% of this Boy Scout issues going on. So we need to understand who actually ran the LDS church, right? Smith taught that plural marriage was part of a restored biblical system, similar to Old Testament patriarchs. And some of his wives were very young. Huh, imagine that. Helen Mar Kimball married Smith at 14 years old, and that was sealed in 1843. Lucy Walker married Smith at about 17. Others were in their late teens. Supporters argue some of these were dynastic sealings or religious family linking rather than normal marriages. But historians debate whether the relationships were purely symbolic or involved normal marital relations. And there's this thing about polyandry, wives already married to other men. Another controversial element is that some of Smith's plural wives already had living husbands. Yes, and these fine people were the ones that helped set up the Boy Scouts of America. Gee, imagine that, right? The practice is sometimes called polyandry. While the marriages were happening, Smith publicly denied practicing polygamy. The LDS church officials denied it as well. So these people have a pretty long history of being liars now, don't they? The controversy exploded in 1844 when dissenters printed the Novo Expositor, accusing Smith of secret polygamy. Smith ordered the press destroyed, which triggered events leading to his arrest and death. Joseph Smith was killed in 1844 in Carthage jail by a mob while awaiting trial. After his death, plural marriage became openly practiced under Brigham Young in Utah. The LDS Church officially ended plural marriage in 1890 with a manifesto issued by Wilford Woodruff. This change happened largely due to pressure from the U.S. government, which had outlawed polygamy. So, Joseph Smith's plural marriages are one of the most debated aspects of early Mormon history. Issues historians still debate. How many wives did he had? What ages were these wives? Marriages to already married women. The secrecy surrounding the practice. So, generally, they're saying that early to mid teens, he had about 2 to 3 wives. Wives that were 16 to 19, he had about 8 to 10 of those wives. Wives that were roughly 10 to 12 years old. Wait, I got that wrong. Wait a second. Oh, wives that were 30 years or older, he had a bunch of those. Okay, most scholars, both LDS and non LDS, agree on several points. Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage privately in the 1840s. The number of wives was likely around 3 dozen. A small number were teenagers, including one as young as 14. The practice was publicly denied during Smith's lifetime and acknowledged later. Plural marriage later became openly practiced in Utah under Brigham Young before the LDS Church officially ended it in 1890. And of course, Brigham Young had about 55 to 56 wives during his lifetime. He had around 16 to 20 children who survived to adulthood and fathered more than 50. Yeah, these Mormons sound like great people to lead the new boys of America, right? Historically, many wives did live with him and had children with him. So, yeah, he had a bunch of young wives too. Young's family structure was extremely large. He had multiple houses in Salt Lake City. Some wives lived in the Beehive House or the Lion House. Others lived in separate houses but remained part of the extended family network. Plural marriages became open practice partly because Utah was geographically isolated after the Mormon migration. Leadership believed plural marriage was a religious commandment. Brigham Young publicly defended it in sermons. The U.S. government later fought the practice for decades, passing anti polygamy laws before the LDS Church formally ended in 1890. So it's not like they gave it up on their own, is it, huh? By the standards of the time, large polygamous families among the Mormon leaders were unusual but not secret after the 1850s. Young himself argued that plural marriage was part of restoring biblical patriarchal practices. But plural marriage in early Mormon Utah was not universal, but it was concentrated among, pay attention here, religious elites, which helped to create large leadership dynasties, strong interfamily alliances, demographic imbalance in marriage patterns. These dynamics shaped Utah society for decades. So, all done by the elites, right? A hierarchy of sexual access and power. Top men had privileges ordinary men did not. Obedience to leadership could shape marriage, family life, and status. Wives, children, and linked families became tied to powerful churchmen economically, socially, and spiritually. There was a marriage scarcity for lower status men. When elite men accumulated multiple wives, it could reduce marriage prospects for other men. Sometimes intermarriage among leading families reinforced internal power. A culture of silence. If the men at the top were the ones defining morality, challenging abuse or coercion became much harder. Gee, you think so? And then there's the issue of blurred consent. In a system where leaders claimed divine authority, choice could be shaped by pressure, fear, and promised spiritual rewards. Protection of insiders. When power, theology, and family networks merge, misconduct could be hidden or excused. It was not community wide, it was top heavy. A system where elite men accumulated wives, children, and influences, while religious authority made resistance dangerous. So leadership had the most wives. In early Utah, the highest ranking church leaders practiced the most extensive plural marriage. They say that Brigham Young had about 55 wives, though not all lived as full spouses. Heber Kimball had about 40 wives. Orson Pratt had about 10, and Wilford Woodruff had about 9. Ordinary members, most men, had one wife or none. Studies of Utah consensus records suggest perhaps 20 to 30% of Mormon families participated in plural marriage at its peak, meaning the majority did not. Plural marriages were often linked to prominent families together. Marrying daughters of other influential families could strengthen loyalty, consolidate leadership networks, bind multiple households to the church hierarchy. Gee, where have we heard this before? Huh, let me think about it. Religion, just this is such a cut and paste operation. It's almost hard to take it seriously, right? Plural marriage was framed as a commandment revealed through Joseph Smith and later enforced in Utah under Brigham Young. Because leaders claimed divine authority, refusing proposals from a high ranking man could carry society and spiritual consequences for families. Some plural marriages were specifically described as dynastic, binding families eternally through temple sealing practices. This meant marriages sometimes had political and spiritual significance, not just domestic ones. But this is the part that should be the most troublesome. If it's all okay and everything's so great, why the big secret? Before the practice was publicly acknowledged in the 1850s, plural marriage was quietly arranged, selectively revealed, tightly controlled by leadership. That secrecy did create layers of information access where insiders knew more than ordinary members. Early Mormon plural marriage functioned primarily as a religious institution and partly as a social power system concentrated among the elites, enforced through leadership networks, binding families to church authority. That combination is why many scholars describe it as a mechanism of both theology and governance in early Utah society. The violence against Mormons in Illinois, including the mob that killed Joseph Smith in 1844, was connected to several tensions at once, and plural marriage secrecy was one of them, but not the only one. The secrecy around plural marriage. When dissenters published the Navajo Expositioner in 1844, they accused Smith of secretly practicing plural marriage, proposing plural marriages to multiple women, introducing doctrines unknown to most members. For critics, the issue was not just polygamy, but the secrecy and denial. Some church leaders had publicly denied plural marriage while it quietly occurred among insiders. That contradiction angered both insiders and outsiders. So, Smith, of course, being the righteous person that he was, he ordered that the press get destroyed, arguing it was libelous. The destruction of the press sparked a legal crisis that led to Smith's arrest. So, who were the participants? Well, aspirational middle class families seeking structural moral development for their sons. So, in simple terms, not the elite and not the poorest. And that was the part that I found interesting was they didn't go after the poor kids to start with. Actually, over in the UK and stuff, they started with the rich kids. So, yeah, this thing kind of flipped it on its head. Many studies also show that boys who reach Eagle Scout rank disproportionately came from families with college educated fathers, higher income households, strong parental involvement. So, when even while scouting, achievement often tracked family resources. So, why churches agreed to sponsor troops? For many churches, the Scouts functioned as a youth ministry program. Benefits included structured activities for boys, leadership training, moral education, recruitment and retention of young families. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints made scouting the official youth program for boys in the United States for decades, sponsoring tens of thousands of troops. So when abuse occurred, the legal questions became who was responsible? Possible defendants included the troop leader, individual offender, the chartered organization, the church or the sponsor, the local Boy Scout council, or the National Boy Scout organization. Because the charter agreement said the sponsor selected and supervised leaders, some lawsuits argued that churches shared responsibility for screening and oversight. But during the bankruptcy negotiations, charter organizations sought legal protection from future lawsuits related to scout troops that they sponsored. So, the United Methodist Church negotiated a $30 million settlement to help protect its congregations. Some Catholic dioceses contributed funds through local councils. The Church of Latter-day Christ of Latter-day Saints reached a separate $250 million settlement in 2022 to resolve claims connected to Mormon-sponsored troops. These payments were part of the larger $2.46 billion survivor trust. Investigations and court records showed that the charter structure sometimes produced diffuse responsibility. Churches assumed the Boy Scouts handled safety policies. Councils assumed churches supervised leaders. National leadership assumed local sponsors controlled the troops. And I would say, whoops, Just like this was all planned on purpose, if you ask me, in abuse cases, this blurred accountability, which became a central issue in litigation. So let's talk about the first one. The scandal that first drew national attention in the 1980s when civil suits began exposing internal documents. A key case occurred in Idaho, 1987, Oregon, Idaho case. A former scout sued the Boy Scouts for abuse by a scout leader. The jury awarded 14 million in damages. Court proceedings revealed internal documents of suspected offenders. This was one of the first moments the internal tracking system became widely known. Roughly 7,800 alleged abusers were recorded in those files. Those individuals were linked to allegations including about 12,000 victims. And I will read you a quote from one of the victims themselves. These judges and attorneys are criminal. How many people have died before they could be made right? My claim was valued at 1.2 million, but my award letter says I was aware the value, but I wouldn't get all of that. So far, I've been given $16,000 in the first check. The second check was $35,000. So I've gotten 4% of my settlement over the last 3 years. Why even issue an award amount so you can throw it in our faces that we will never see it? The judges, Barbara Hauser, and these corrupt attorneys are sucking our money up in fees and could give a rat's ass about us victims. So the record showed 7,800 alleged abusers that they had on the records, right? And here's the catch right here. Many scout leaders were church members. Gee, I imagine they didn't get on those lists now, don't you? Because churches sponsored a large share of troops. Many adult volunteers were members of the sponsoring church. They had parents in the congregation. They were sometimes clergy or church youth leaders. For example, troops sponsored by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, or LDS, were often led by adult male members of the congregation assigned by the church. Similar patterns existed in Catholic and Methodist organizations. Court filings and the released ineligible volunteer files show that some individuals accused of abuse were troop leaders, assistant scoutmasters, marriage badge instructors, and camp staff. In troops sponsored by churches, those individuals could also be members of the church that chartered the troop. But the offenders were not limited to clergy. Most of the accused individuals documented in Boy Scout files were volunteer leaders or adults connected to the troop, not necessarily ordained clergy. They often included teachers, community leaders, parents, and youth leaders. So, why did this become a legal issue? Well, because churches sponsor the troops. Lawsuits sometimes argue that the chartered organizations had responsibility for screening and supervising leaders. At the same time, the Boy Scouts of America maintained its own internal files documenting suspected offenders. That overlapping structure, church sponsor, local council, national organization, became central to the litigation over who was responsible. These lists were never the whole truth. They were administrative records of who the institutions chose to mark as a problem, not a full accounting of who was protected at the top. And that is just my opinion. I wrote that quote. I'm the only one calling this out. Something is going on here. something is going on. There has to be a second list somewhere. It just doesn't make sense if there's not some other list, right? Of course, these elites would keep themselves off the public list, right? So the Catholic Church is much larger globally, but harder to count precisely because it spans many countries. Why the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts appear so often. Researchers studying institutional abuse note similar structural conditions, access to children. Both institutions had routine, unsupervised contact with minors on scouting trips, confessions, youth camps, boarding schools, and parish programs. Authority and trust. Adults were granted automatic moral authority. Priests were seen as spiritual leaders. Scoutmasters were seen as mentors. That trust reduced suspicion. In both systems, investigators found patterns such as internal reporting rather than police reports, moving offenders to new locations, protecting the reputation of the institution. This pattern is sometimes called institutional self protection. While the BSA and the Catholic Church are prominent, historians and legal scholars also cite other institutions with major cause cases. We have the residential and boarding schools, the Canadian Indian residential school system. We have all the youth detention facilities, reform schools, juvenile justice systems, religious orphanages and reformatories, youth sports programs. Many of these cases involved long periods before abuse was exposed. Across many investigations, the same pattern appears. Warnings are reported internally. Leadership handles it privately. Offenders are quietly moved or removed. Victims are rarely believed at first. Large lawsuits eventually expose records. So, and let's talk about these boys. The boys were also killed during these wars, right? A lot of these Boy Scouts that they first sent out to war and stuff actually got killed. I looked into that a bit because during World War I, roughly 10,000 to 15,000 boys were killed. World War II, roughly 60,000 to 100,000 were killed. During both wars, governments openly promoted scouting as a way to build patriotic and physical fit future soldiers. That connection between youth training and military preparedness was widely accepted in the early 20th century. One of the first cases that I could find was the Cleveland Street Scandal, and that was over in the UK. Telegraph boys were exploited in a London brothel. Elite clients were implicated. The scandal reached close to the royal court. Around the same period, educators began warning about abuse inside boarding schools, hazing and sexual violence among students, and predatory teachers. However, these warnings were rarely publicly pursued. The argument is that Baden-Powell, the guy that started the whole thing off, had what psychologists sometimes informally call a Peter Pan complex. An adult who strongly identifies with childhood and youth culture and resists the idea of adult maturity. He romanticized boyhood. Baden-Powell's writing constantly framed boys as living in a world of adventure, games, secret codes, and camp life. His 1908 book, Scouting for Boys, essentially turns childhood into a permanent frontier adventure. He structured the movement around perpetual play. And remember in the very beginning, I was telling you children see things as play, right? And this guy set it up exactly to track what children are already seeing. Scouting emphasized games, tracking, costumes, signaling, secret rituals, and role playing, patrols, badges, and uniforms. Critics say this created a system where adults remained immersed in boy culture. He also personally behaved in ways some biographers saw as childlike. Several historians note that Baden-Powell loved dressing up, performing skits, playing elaborate games, and communicating with boys through imaginative storytelling. So let's talk a little bit about this Peter Pan business. Peter Pan made his first appearance in the Little White Bird book. Barry was the author. Barry's thinly veiled novel about George that today, excuse me, the author was named Barrie, Barrie. The first book about where Peter Pan first appeared was called The Little White Bird, okay? So the person said, with our sensitivity, sexual predatory, this book had a creepy tone. And this talks about Pan, the Pan god, and I will go over it now. They have admitted all of this. Ancient Greece, Pan worship as a nature god. Middle Ages, Pan imagery merges with devil. 1800s, romantic revival of pagan myth. 1904, Peter Pan was introduced in theaters. 1907 to 1908, Boy Scouts was founded. Who the god Pan was. In Greek mythology, Pan was a nature deity of forests, mountains, and shepherds. He was depicted with goat legs, horns, and a flute called the panpipes. Pan was associated with wilderness, sexuality, and untamed nature. The source of the word panic or pandemic because his sudden appearance was said to frighten travelers. Pan represented instinct, wilderness, and freedom from civilized rulers. And then the biggest supporter of Pan was Ozzy Osbourne. So Ozzy Osbourne, I'm having some trouble. Ozzy Osbourne was big into Pan. The scene shows Ozzy sitting in a dark Gothic library surrounded by occult looking objects and candles. Behind Ozzy Osbourne appears a horned goat like creature, often interpreted as a Pan like figure or demonic entity. So, why did the author J.M. Barrie use the name Pan? And that's Barrie, Barrie. The author J.M. Barrie almost certainly drew on the classical myth intentionally. Peter Pan shares several symbolic traits with the Greek god. Wild child of nature. Peter Pan lives outside civilization in Neverland, similar to Pan living in forests. Musical and playful spirit. Pan plays pipes. Peter Pan is constantly playful and mischievous. Refusal of adult society. Both figures represent freedom from society rules and adulthood. Pan in myth leads nymphs and spirits. Peter leads the lost boys. So the name Pan signals a wild, eternal spirit of youth and nature. But some people link it to secret societies. The speculation comes from the fact that Pan imagery appears in some occult or esoteric traditions, such as the 19th and early 20th century when Barrie was writing. Groups influenced by romantic mysticism sometimes use Pan as a symbol of primal nature, liberation from social constraints, and ancient pagan wisdom. However, historians generally see Barrie's use of Pan as literally symbolism. And then we have Crowley. Crowley, the man called the Great Beast 666 and dubbed by the press as the wickedest man in history. Classified documents have since revealed that the Great Beast 666 led a double life. Crowley apparently maintained ties with the British government and worked with the British intelligence and high ranking members of the American government. The OTO, the secret society he popularized, held within its ranks some of the most influential people of the time, who in turn used their power to further the advancement of its main philosophy, the Thelema. That's Thelema. And then he has this little the Knight of the Pan. This was from Crowley. So in literature, Peter Pan, the spirit of childhood that refuses civilization. The name Pan reinforces the idea that Peter is wild, free, outside adult society, closer to myth than reality. In other words, Barry, the author, used a pagan nature god as a metaphor for eternal boyhood. The connection between Peter Pan and Robert Baden-Powell is not accidental. It developed in the same Edwardian social circle in Britain around 1900 to 1910, and Baden-Powell openly referenced the story when describing the spirit of scouting. So, yes, they 100% have all said, yes, the Pan in Peter Pan came from Pan the goat, okay? So, Peter Pan appears first in 1902 to 1904. The character was created by J.M. Barrie. In 1902, Barrie introduces Peter Pan in the novel The Little White Bird. In 1904, there was a stage play called Peter Pan or The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up that premiered in London. The story becomes widely popular with British upper class families and educators. Huh. The central theme, a boy who refuses to grow up and lives permanently in a world of childhood adventure. This theme strongly overlapped with the youth culture Baden-Powell was building. And this is the part that gets very interesting. Barrie first named the play The Boy Who Hated Mothers. The original title reflected Barrie's complex relationship with his mother, his two failed marriages, and the fact that although he raised the Llewellyn Davies children as their guardian, Barrie had no biological children. Some speculate Barrie never consummated his marriages. It seems that J.M. Barrie based the character of Peter Pan on himself. And I'm going to pick this up on the other side. And this is such a weird case because normally they would have denied that Pan didn't have anything to do with this, but they have, in fact, said that yes, Peter Pan was modeled after the Pan god. And that Pan god is known for all kinds of horrible things. I'll get more into this Pan stuff when I return, but basically, Pan has many names. One is people consider Pan is actually Satan. So I guess Satan can have many figures, right? And some actually claim that Pan is one of the Satan ones. And also the god of sexual deviance, rape, and torture. Kind of an interesting character to put as a figure for Peter Pan, right? To go around the boys and all that kind of stuff. So I'll be back on the other side. Okay, a couple things before I get started here. A new book came out in the last year or so about Opus Dei. And let me see here. It is actively influencing real world church dynamics right now in 2026. And the book has already shifted scrutiny onto excuse me. The book has already shifted scrutiny onto elite religious networks. The Pope met directly with the author, And the author is named Garrett Gore, Gore. And the Pope met directly with the author in March of 2026, highly unusual for a journalist. Gore reportedly pushed for a formal investigation into Opus Dei. Allegations now being discussed at high levels include sexual abuse cover up, financial networks tied to global influence, and exploitation of members, including women in Argentina. Opus Dei, of course, denies all allegations, calling them false or distorted. The book is Opus, the cult of dark money, human trafficking, and right wing conspiracy inside the Catholic Church. It argues Opus Dei built global influence networks, including finance, politics, and the church, connects the group to the collapse of Banco Popular and the alleged movement of billions of dollars, financial misconduct, labor exploitation, psychological and spiritual control of members. The author frames Opus Dei less as a traditional religious group and more as a closed, elite power structure operating across institutions. Well, I think this is probably just a big setup because now the church is not saying much, but the Pope may be positioning himself to investigate or act, but hasn't decided yet. So he listened to this guy and said, "Oh yeah, well we'll think about it. We'll think about it." This is just another delay tactic, right? Well, we've heard. I was talking about this book this guy wrote about Opus Dei, and this is something we better look into. And me, as the new Pope Leo, I got to take the charge in all this. Delay, 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 the biggest tricks on earth. So, anyway, it was printed or published on October 2024. And also down below, a couple of things I will not have the time to get into. This thing could go on for weeks and months about all this Pan business and Peter Pan and Boy Scouts and all this stuff, but there's a long article that somebody wrote about Ozzy Osbourne and his connections to Pan and Crowley and all that stuff. And I have all of that published down below or on my website. And there's also a long, wild, and really insane story about that author Barry and how they got started with Peter Pan. Long and convoluted, but it's also down below. Here's where I think this is heading to. I think this is teaching boys disassociation. I just want you to hear what I'm saying here because this whole Peter Pan thing, the fantasy, oh, you're in another world, you're going back, and this, that. I believe this is just my opinion. Haven't heard anybody else saying it, but I believe this was an early training tool to teach these kids about disassociation. Almost every case of prostitution, child abuse, and all of that, the person is in fact disassociated. So these sickos think they're having sex with a child, but that child is really not there. That child is really dreaming of something else, right? That is exactly how it works. Same thing with that prostitute. Nobody wakes up and says, "Yeah, I want to sleep with 30 men today. I want to have a violent, horrible life for myself." Now, that doesn't how it works, but I would guarantee you probably 99.9% of prostitution also includes disassociation. I know a lot about disassociation. I'll tell you more about that later when I get to the DOJ business because I spent most of my life disassociated. So I know a lot about this subject, but not for today. So let me keep going. So yeah, that's my feeling is teaching these kids about Peter Pan was teaching them how to disassociate so then they wouldn't put together the abuse of these monsters in charge of these Boy Scouts and stuff, right? Because the typical abused person in cases like this does not come forward before like 30 or 40 years. I'll have more about that in a bit, but I mean, it is a really, really long time. You're abused at 10, you may not talk about it until you're 40 or 50 years old. So there's a big span in there. And I think it's because of the disassociation. But enough of that for now. So let me talk about Barry, the author. Barry put these emotions into his art, creating Peter Pan, a week old baby who runs away to play with the fairies and feels rejected when he returns to discover his window closed and his mother cuddling another baby. In The Boy Who Won't Grow Up, Peter Pan is a tween searching for a mother to bring back to Neverland, settling on Wendy and her descendants to care for him and his lost boys. Wendy isn't a proper mother. She is still a child, caring for other children, as his mother and sister once did. Pan is also known for his ability to incite panic, leading this god into the realm of trickster gods. And it makes sense that Satan has more than one gods, right? Peter's moral ambiguity and rebelliousness center him squarely in the realm of trickster figures. Peter Pan certainly embodies the archetype of one who revels in chaos. He regularly incites it by starting fights with Captain Hook, encouraging wildness in the Lost Boys, and insisting the only rule in Netherland is that you can't grow up. Peter lures Peter Pan lures children like Wendy and her brothers to Netherland, much like Periscope was kidnapped and taken to the underworld by Hades. This connection brings us back to Peter Pan's connection to an obsession with death. Although Peter Pan is depicted as mischievous in Disney's sanitized version of the tale, in the original play and book, Peter is decidedly more sinister. His affinity with the mermaids who transform into sirens in the moonlight suggests Peter Pan himself might be prone to transformation as well. And you hear about those mermaids, right? You notice mermaids on those Starbucks cups. Mermaids are two sexes. So Peter lures children like Wendy and her brothers to Neverland, much like Periscope was kidnapped and taken to the underworld by Hades. This connection brings us back to Peter Pan. Peter Pan's connection to an obsession with death. He is sometimes associated with sexual excess in mythology, but classical sources do not portray him primarily as a god of rape or torture. The name Pan was used mainly because Barry wanted a wild, woodland, mischievous spirit. Barry was also known to have had friendships with other children, both before he met the Davies boys, and that whole story is down below, a little bit too crazy to go into right now. But so Barry was also known to have friendships with other children, both before he met the Davies boys and after they had grown up. There have been accusations that Barry was a pedophile. One source for the speculation is due to a scene in the novel The Little White Bird, in which the protagonist, who resembles Barry, helps a small boy undress for bed. And at the boy's request, they sleep in the same bed. Disney's whitewashed version of the character has toned down the sexual perversion, but still retains the double like attributes, enticing the little girl to leave her parents' authority and go to a place with no rules. There is only one thing you have to do: leave home behind and you can never come back. It's the same lie Lucifer told the angels in heaven. Don't you want to go to don't you want to go to a place where they don't even have to follow the rules? All you have to do is leave home behind and you can never ever come back. Pan's friends, not accidentally called the Lost Boys, inhabit an island called Neverland, where selfishness and do what thou wilt is the rule of the day. Kind of sounds like a similar story where a bunch of pirates or lost angels inhabit this island in space called planet Earth. Michael Jackson was so obsessed with the story of Peter Pan that he ended up building his own private theme park in his backyard called Neverland. And that's why I love all these weird details. I never knew, well, a lot of people probably knew it, but I had no connection between Michael Jackson and Peter Pan. So, like Barry, Jackson seems to have an infatuation with the sexual deviant god Pan, as depicted in the artwork hanging in his studio. The painting has Jackson surrounded with naked little boys and girls while holding the pan pipes. His ranch full of sculptures of little boys and girls. The very flag and logo for the Neverland Ranch is of a little boy. Coincidence? Well, you be the judge. Ham is Satan, the god of sexual deviance, rape, and torture. And the full article will be down below. I'm just going to read an excerpt. Despite the declaration of his death, however, Pan is widely worshipped by neo-pagans and Wiccans today, where he is considered a powerful god and an archetype of male virility and sexuality. Pan is famous for his sexual prowess and is often depicted with an erect phallus. He is believed by the Greeks to have plied his charms primarily on maidens and shepherds such as dolphins. Though he failed with Sphinx and Pitys, Pan didn't fail with the Machinians, Maenads. He had every one of them in one orgastic riot or another. To effect this, Pan is sometimes multiplied into a whole tribe of Pans. It is likely that the demonized images of the incubus and even the horns and cloven and hooves of Satan, as depicted in much Christian literature and art, were taken from the images of the highly sexual Pan. And I have a very grotesque picture of Pan in the middle of a sex act that you can find on my website. This stuff is very, very twisted. And then you have to think, oh, well, Pan and Peter Pan, and Boy Scouts, quite a wild and sick ride we're on, right? So, let me keep reading from this article. Yeah, and Pam's producer admits the dark nature of the film. So, yeah, they came right out and said, yes, this is exactly what we're talking about. It is a profane, morally corrupt movie. For anyone who understands who Pan is, what he does, and the evil he embodies, it is unthinkable that someone would actually place an innocent little girl into such a settings in a movie, portraying her as falling in love with Pan. And then they keep saying, please read the exhaustive study on the infatuation which Aleister Crowley had with the pagan god Pan and the sexually immoral nature of Pan. It is creepy and bizarre stuff. The people who make movies like Pan's Labyrinth, which features an innocent little girl falling in love with Pan, are sick minded, demonically inspired, sexually perverted, evil individuals as far as I'm concerned. The evidence speaks for itself. There is no downplaying the facts about Pan. The occult has always been synonymous with child exploitation. And then they go on to talk about the Franklin cover up here in Omaha, murder in Nebraska. Um, so it is tragic enough that this wickedness occurs in real life. Why, in the name of decency, would movie makers want to make such a filthy movie as Pan's Labyrinth? The answer is obvious. They are perverts themselves. The film's sexually suggestive script is frightening. The mere mention of the demonic god Pan is evidence enough of this fact. The scriptwriters deceitfully put forth the context of a little innocent girl who falls in love with a faun. A faun? You mean Pan? Look at their website, main page, and tell me if that looks like a faun to you. The truth is that the term faun sounds much like the less offensive than Pan or Satan. In lieu of the sinister descriptions of Pan I provided you from Wikipedia, it's quite obvious to me why they avoid saying that the little girl falls in love with Pan. When the scriptwriters turned the context around to where Pan falls in love with a 12-year-old girl, do you see where this is going? The spirit of pedophilia is unmistakably at work in Pan's Labyrinth. That is only my opinion as a Christian. So, advertisement photo for Pan's Labyrinth showing the entrance to it's called the Labrinth. Please notice the ram's horns, which represent Satan. Also notice the little girl's about to enter. So I think it's pretty clear that um, clearly Satan is the spiritual power behind all rock music, including Christian rock. Yeah, and they tie in that stuff about they said the music of the Beach Boys may sound harmless, but it is demonic as all rock and roll music. One of the great dangers, blah blah blah. Okay, If you think I'm being ridiculous, then consider the fact that Paul McCartney did the same exact thing in his 1971 album Ram, RAM. Pictured to the left is Paul McCartney's 1971 album cover. It's a goat and a ram. Yeah, they love those goats and those goat horns and stuff. The goat of Mendes is a goat of the witches. So I don't know. It's all part of that Baphomet, the Baal worship, and all that stuff, this pan business. So let's take a look at how we got started here. In 1907, Baden-Powell, with that hyphenated name, and I'll explain in a minute, runs the experimental Browns Island Scout Camp. 1908, he publishes Scouting for Boys, the manual that launched the global scout movement. The book framed boyhood as a special, heroic stage of life full of adventure, outdoor exploration, games, secret codes, and tribal symbolism. This was culturally very close to Barrie's fictional Neverland. So, Baden-Powell explicitly mentions Peter Pan. By the 1910s to 1920s, Baden-Powell was openly referencing the story. In speeches and writings, he used Peter Pan as a metaphor for the spirit of scouting. One of his comments paraphrased this idea. The spirit of Peter Pan is the spirit of the scout, always ready for adventure. He used Peter Pan as an example of imagination, boyhood independence, resistance to dull adult life. In other words, disassociate, right? Baden-Powell and Barrie moved in overlapping elite London circles. Barrie was close to the Edward the Seventh's court. He was close to aristocratic families. So the same social circles supported the early scout movement. In fact, Barrie publicly endorsed scouting. So I got them all right at the root, right? But modern historians focus on a psychological angle. The key issue is Baden-Powell's idealization of boyhood. Several scholars argue that he romanticized childhood, distrusted adult life, built an organization centered on boys and male bonding. This is sometimes called the Peter Pan complex, meaning an adult man psychologically investing in remaining emotionally connected to childhood. So yeah, and they do mirror it. You know, they have the Peter Pan has private battles, and the Boy Scouts have mock battles tracking games. Yeah, they all. If you can find me a way this does not connect, then please let me know, okay? And Barrie also donated the copyright of Peter Pan to the Greater Ormondson Street Hospital in 1929. Yeah, make sure all those kids can get it. Get rid of the copyright. Give it away to everybody. Let's tell everybody about Pan. So, around 1900 Britain, there was a broad movement to shape boys into imperial citizens. Organizations included Boy Scouts, Boys Brigade, which were church youth groups, cadet corps, and public school athletic programs. Peter Pan fit perfectly into that culture: eternal boyhood, adventure, loyalty, and brotherhood. Peter Pan wasn't officially part of scouting doctrine, but Baden Powell repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, I found it in tons and tons of cases, he used the character as a metaphor for the spirit of the moment. Well, if you look at what Pan is, a wild rapist, right? The overlap happened because both were products of the same British elite. They were both part of the same elite culture around 1900 that idealized boyhood and adventure. So Robert Stevenson Smith Baden Powell became the full formal name of the Boy Scouts founder. That's Robert Stevenson Smith Baden Powell. And here I'll answer why that hyphenated name. I love these odd details. Okay, so hyphenated names were a status signal back then. In Britain, during the 1800s, hyphenated surnames often indicated inherited estates, maternal family prestige, aristocratic connections, or a desire to appear socially elevated. Of course, we had Winston Churchill had a hyphenated name, Bertrand Russell. Um, in modern discussions about the Boy Scout founder, people notice the name because it looks aristocratic or constructed. It reflects the elite social networks Baden-Powell moved in. His family was tied to Oxford academia, the military, and imperial administration. But historically, the name itself is not unusual for British elite families of the time. So Baden was originally the first name of the Powell family, and Robert's generation turned it into a hyphenated surname, or Baden-Powell, to preserve the family lineage and signal status, something fairly common in Victorian Britain. So then that's when Baden-Powell became a national celebrity after the siege of Mayfield, which was 1899 to 1900 during the Second Boer War. His hero status gave him credibility with British Army leadership, imperial administrators, colonial governments, and upper class schools. Early scouting manuals were essentially military scouting manuals rewritten for boys. His book, Scouting for Boys, drew heavily from reconnaissance training, tracking and surveillance, discipline, and chains of command. Many historians describe it as military preparedness disguised as youth education. The Boy Scouts gained legitimacy extremely quickly. And why, you ask? Because royal patrons adopted it early. Key supporters included Edward VII, George V. Royal patronage did several things. It legitimized the organization, opened doors to schools and churches, encouraged upper class families to send sons into the program. Once the monarchy endorsed it, local elites and clergy followed. And this is the part that was unusual, that they started off with a more elite class of children. So from the beginning, churches became the main infrastructure for scouting troops. In Britain and later in the United States, they were Anglican churches, Methodist congregations, Catholic parishes, and later Mormon congregations. They all served as chartering organizations. So yes, they were all in on it from the very start. This structure allowed extremely rapid expansion. And of course, everybody was impressed. Oh, look, we got to send Johnny to the Boy Scouts. It was endorsed by the king. Did you see that? Yeah, the raping royals again, right? Get those kids in those plans. So, Britain's elite schools were already running cadet corps programs before scouting. These schools trained future military officers, and they were the elite boarding schools, colonial administrators, and politicians. Scouting fit perfectly into this culture. Many early scout leaders, and listen to this, came directly from Eton, Harrow, military academies, and colonial officer networks. And that part really got me because normally they start off abusing the poor kids first, right? So scouting appeared at a very specific moment in history, right when the Britain wins the Boer Wars, but realizes youth fitness is declining. British military commissions warn of weak recruits. And then Baden-Powell launches experimental scout camp, and scouting spreads nationally, and then World War I begins. Many policymakers believe youth needed discipline and outdoor training to strengthen the empire. So, scouting became part of a broader imperial culture of masculinity training, patriotism, physical conditioning, loyalty to crown and country. The early movement gained help from British publishing houses, aristocratic donors, church institutions, and military networks. The movement was not initially run by government, but by the elite social class around the empire effectively sponsored it. The American organization, Boy Scouts of America, or BSA, was created in 1910 and quickly gained backing from major churches, business leaders, political figures, and wealthy donors. Corporate sponsorship later included companies such as oil companies, banks, industrial corporations, because scouting was viewed as a leadership pipeline for boys or as a pipeline for boys to rape by the elites, right? No matter what way you look at it. Originally, scouting was marketed as character building and outdoor adventure. Well, I guess they really couldn't say, hey, send us your boys. We want to rape every one of them. So, of course, they have to come up with a bunch of BS, right? Hey, send your boys. Make them start to look like us. Regal, alert, out there in the forest. So, all the churches got involved, all the civic groups got involved, all the major corporate powers, the railroads, the oil companies, insurance companies, national retailers. Youth organizations at the time were seen as a way to shape future citizens. No, not how I see it, but you have to decide for yourself. The Boy Scouts of America abuse scandal is one of the largest child abuse cases in U.S. history, and probably bigger than we will ever find out. For decades, the Boy Scouts promised parents honor, safety, and leadership for their sons. Instead, court records reveal a century long pattern of hidden abuse and institutional silence. So, we start off with scouts typically they just can't give up this three thing, right? The pyramid thing. And scouts do a three-finger salute. Boy, are they ever repetitious. Scouts typically use a three-finger salute when they reciting the scout oath, reciting the scout law, during flag ceremonies, during official scouting pledges or meetings. Although wording of the oath varies by country, the three finger salute remains a universal scouting symbol of loyalty, duty, and service. Or how about rape, harm, and misuse, right? So, religious institutions, particularly churches, appear repeatedly in the background of many large institutional abuse cases. The church often shows up not only because clergy was involved, but because churches controlled the organizational infrastructure where youth programs operated from. And then we had the rebranding. Let me see here. Boy Scouts of America, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so then we have the Girl Scouts. Girls were allowed to enter, join Cub Scout. Too convoluted for today. Okay, so BSA, and then I think they did a trick when they allowed the girls in, but I'm not going to go. Oh, I have a lot to cover today. But what they did was they did a change around 2015. BSA removed the ban on openly gay adult leaders and girls. And I think that was a trick point there because all this stuff was going on there. So I think they kind of threw that out there as a, I don't know, it's kind of like, hey, look what we're doing. We're doing good stuff. We're letting the girls in. We're letting the gays in. So it was 2017, the major strategic pivot. BSA announced that girls would be admitted to the Cub Scouts and eventually the older programs. This was the moment the organization began restructuring scouting. So yeah, I think they let the girls in because, and then they also said, that, oh, anyways. I think they let the girls in as a distraction. So um, let's talk a little bit about this LDS stuff. They were involved as a huge part of the Boy Scouts, the church over in Utah. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yeah, you imagine where I'm going with this Jesus part, right? So, Boy Scout, excuse me, what they did, they left the Boy Scouts. They probably too hot in town, right? So, after leaving the Boy Scouts of America, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints did not create a new outside scouting group. Instead, it launched an internal program called Children and Youth, and that was announced in 2018 and implemented in 2020. The program replaced scouting in LDS congregations worldwide and focused on religious learning, service, and personal development for both boys and girls. So there has never been a major public scandal tied specifically to the children and youth program. I couldn't find anything on them, but the LDS Church replaced Boy Scouts with its own internal youth program, but debates about child safety practices and reporting procedures within the church were already underway and continue to be discussed today. So, yeah, right now, starting in the mid 16, 2016, 2018, now we're in the phase they like to stump people with, right? Well, we've heard all your complaints, and now we're going to think about it. So now we're going to talk to our attorney, and before you know it, 20 years will pass, and they'll be thinking about it, right? So I couldn't help but ask LDS members and Jesus. So, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints is explicitly Christ centered in its theology. Their official name emphasizes that. LDS believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and Savior of humanity. Well, God save us all if this is true. His atonement and resurrection are central to salvation. The Bible is scripture along with additional LDS texts. So, yeah, they're all in there. And the LDS Church is considered one of the wealthiest religious institutions in the entire world. I did a show about them not that long ago. There's been allegations that they control roughly $100 billion in investments. All these people have been given the money all this time, and instead of supporting it for groups and stuff, they've just been spending it. They invest in all kinds of stock market stuff, all kinds of stuff that nobody thought that they should be investing in, right? So the church also owns vast farmland holdings in the U.S., ranches and agriculture operations, real estate developments, media and publishing assets, commercial properties. And there's a lot of LDS people online. That Johnny Harris is LDS. They all have kind of a look. And there's that one doctor, he's always selling vitamins and stuff. Yeah, they all come out of Utah and they're all LDS, but you'll never get them to admit that though, because they're expected to donate 10% of their income, and LDS finances are highly centralized. Funds have been invested aggressively for decades. They have about 17 million members worldwide. They are extremely wealthy. Um, Catholic Church likely controls far larger total assets worldwide, but the LDS is unusual because its wealth is highly centralized and transparent through one institution. So the LDS Church is deeply focused on Jesus and its theology. And obvious, they're also very good at racking up and saving money, right? And they also do some weird things. And because I like weird details, I'm going to subject you to my weird things about the LDS Church. Over there in Utah, the LDS people are traditionally prohibited from things like no coffee, no tea, no alcohol, no tobacco, avoid harmful things, right? Because the text itself does not explicitly mention caffeine. So, what they I told you it was weird. What they have over in Utah, and I've been talking for a long time now that cancer and sugar, they've known about the sugar and cancer connection since the 30s. Well, I've had a particular interest in this because I'm also dying of cancer and other elite cooked up deals, right? So sugar is really, really bad. I mean, the only reason I'm still alive 5 years later is because I've had zero added sugar. So, you know, I haven't been eating the normal American diet, which I never really did. But here's the funny thing about those LDS people that I found. So they tell them that they can't have coffee and tea and stuff, right? But it's okay to have cola, energy drinks, and caffeinated soda. That's technically allowed. So, for decades, some LDS leaders discouraged caffeine informally, but it was never a formal rule. The culture shifted in 2012 when Brigham Young University be- so the culture shift became obvious in 2012. I like to get to the root of things. So, Brigham Young University began selling caffeinated sodas on campus after years of only offering caffeine-free options. So, this caffeine and the soda business started around 2012. Well, so what does that mean? Well, now they have these big places called one is called Swig, and the other is Sodalicious. They sell large flavored sodas mixed with syrups, cream, and candy. Many cultural observers think these shops became popular partially because coffee shops were discouraged. People still wanted a social beverage culture. So it looks odd from the outside because to someone outside the LDS culture, it can look inconsistent. Like coffee is banned, but caffeinated sugary drinks are widely consumed. So, but inside the traditional rule is interpreted very literally. Avoid the specific drinks the revelation named, and they only named coffee and tea. So, high caffeine drinks violate the spirit of the health code, but others say, well, if the scripture doesn't prohibit it explicitly, it's permitted. So let's take a look at some of these drinks, okay? Um, some of these drinks could have 120 to 160 grams of sugar per drink, okay? Per drink, okay? And then also coming out of Utah are these crumble style cookies. Those are all coming out of Utah also. A single cookie from Crumble Cookies is a very large, often 4 to 5 inches wide, and usually meant to be split. But they never told people this in the beginning. They hid the the fact about the calories. So each cookie is about 550 to 575 calories, and the sugar is about 45 to 75 grams per sugar. So they're talking about 80 grams of sugar per cookie, right? I think I don't know. I think you got to wonder about a government that or a government organization like the LDS that is kind of encouraging their people to guzzle down things which will eventually lead to cancer. Hey, they hate us that much that they will take their own followers and encourage them to suck in all this sugar and stuff. I guess for the outside effect that maybe, well, I don't know. I'm not going to say. So let me keep going here. I'm going to take another break here. I'm not doing very well. What I'm trying to do is get as many shows recorded while I'm still in a semi-functional space, so to speak. So I'm going to get back in a few minutes. Be safe out there, and I'll be right back. Okay, I am back, and let me keep going through my list here. I'm able to prove in this show that this was all cooked up by the elites. This is all their kind of thing. Another thing about Baden-Powell, he married a very young woman. And not that marrying a young woman is like a crime in itself, but I found out about this because I was listening to half a million or so different things out there, and I heard Baden-Powell himself say that his mother had been hounding him to get married. So I stopped and took a look. His mother, a very, well, let's say a brutish looking woman, she had been demanding that he get married. Well, there's a certain logic to all of this, right? A married scout trooper would not look quite the same as a British guy who's all by himself. So mom probably had a reason for all this. So let's talk about his marriage. Baden-Powell married Olav Baden-Powell in 1912. He was 55 years old. She was 23. They met through scouting circles. Large age gap marriages were not unusual among British elites at the time, but modern readers often see it as uncomfortable. Olive later became the world chief guide of the Girl Scouts movement, so she got her hands on the girls. Yeah, well, a lot of reasons. Psychopaths is all about control. They have to control the whole thing, so what better to control than your own wife, right? Marry a young one, mold her into your own thing, and there you go. So anyway, so the early scouting movement had strong backing from the British aristocracy, military leadership, and churches. Modern critics argue the structure created conditions that predators could exploit, even if that was not Baden-Powell's intent. And I would have to argue, yeah, this was all the intent of all of these people, right? Come up with this plan between the royals and the churches to get their hands on the boys. Seems like a pretty straightforward thing to me. But of course, they couldn't say that, right? Well, give us your boys. We want to rape them off. No, it had to be. We want to do the right thing. We honor these boys. We want to teach them loyalty and all that stuff. Yeah, okay. So anyhow, so long after Baden-Powell's death in 1941, what a shame, what a shame. Hate to see the old boy die. Abuse scandals started emerging. The most significant involved internal files documenting suspected offenders inside Boy Scouts of America, those records known as the ineligible volunteer files or perversion files. Lawsuits began in the 1980s, and these lawsuits all came from civil lawsuits. And that gave the big release of all the internal documents. And of course, being the stand up people they are, they filed for bankruptcy in 2020. 2022 settlement is roughly $2.4 billion with survivors. The survivors are saying it is a very bad, bad deal. Of course, the attorneys all got paid, so really, who's going to win in this deal? So, Baden Powell created a youth structure centered on adult male authority. That structure later allowed large scale abuse to occur within scouting organizations. Evidence of Baden Powell personally committing abuse has never been proven, but his system did create a culture of loyalty and silence that critics say made abuse easier to hide. Well, yeah, they hid it from the very beginning, right? I mean, you come up with a list and secrets from the very beginning, and there you go. 100 years later, you finally get caught, right? I don't think the arrogance of a psychopath really allows them to think about when they're going to get caught, right? That doesn't really enter the thinking along this time frame. So the founder, Baden Powell of Scouting, built a system where boys were trained to obey adult leaders without question. Gee, what could have gone wrong? Decades later, that same structure became one of the largest child abuse scandals in American history. Yeah, rigged from the beginning. Churches historically carried strong moral authority, especially in the early mid 1900s. Parents were encouraged to trust clergy, scoutmasters, youth ministers, and teachers in church schools. That trust structure created what researchers call institutional guardianship, the belief that someone inside the institution was already protecting the children. And here again, totally inversion, right? Since the 1990s, we're right now in the year 2026, okay? So since the 1990s to the early 2000s, many organizations have implemented safeguards. Boy, isn't this amazing, right? It only took them 100 years. They thought all along, yeah, children going alone, sleeping in tents with strangers, adults, children riding in cars with strangers, all these people they should be trusting, right? So they adopted these practices, mandatory reporting laws, background checks, two adult supervision rules, youth protection training. The Boy Scouts of America and many church groups adopted these policies after major lawsuits and investigations. Whoops, they got caught. The church often appears in these cases not just because clergy were involved, but because religious institutions historically operated much of the youth infrastructure in the United States. A very convenient move if you're a pedophile, now isn't it? While systematic failures occurred inside those programs, the church inevitably shows up in the background because scouting requires transportation, camping trips alone with strangers, meetings, and volunteer leadership. It favored families with time, stability, and paternal involvement in the beginning. So, in the beginning, historically, the organization was overwhelmingly white, especially in the early 20th century. In the Jim Crow era, many Southern troops were segregated and black participation was limited or organized separately. Modern research still finds participation disproportionately white in some samples. One study found about 69% white participants. Over time, the BSA tried to expand diversity programs such as Scout Reach to recruit urban and lower income youth. So, supposedly about 70% of them were organized by religious organizations. 30% were sponsored by civic groups or schools. That meant many scouts came from church connected families. If you combine multiple studies and membership reports, the typical historical Boy Scout profile looks something like this: white, middle or upper middle class, two-parent household, church connected family, suburban or small town environment, parents that are able to volunteer or pay activity costs. This does not mean other kids were not involved, but statistically they were underrepresented. You get my point. Okay, so the Boy Scouts started implementing changes. Isn't that nice of them to come changes? A change when somebody gets caught is never the same, right? It's not like, oh, we were running this organization for 50 years and we found some flaws and we thought, well, let's make some changes. No, these people were beaten into the corner and they had to. This was forced. Do I believe this change is really going? Well, of course not. The secrecy part, right? Secrecy. They're still taking kids around in tents and stuff. Let's talk about their logo, another indicator of elite. I'm trying in this show to indicate that this entire idea of raping these kids came from the elite class, okay? Their logo is a fleur de lis. Long before the fleur de lis became the national flower of France, it was both a religious symbol. I couldn't make this up if I tried for 1,000 years. So, long before the fleur de lis became the national flower of France, it was both a religious symbol of the Catholic Church and a royal symbol in France. And look at the top of fence posts. All around this country, there's fleur de lis on the top of most fence posts. Look around the White House, fleur de lis are all over the place. French kings and the French monarchy used the fleur de lis on flags, clothing, crowns, staffs, coat of arms, and decorative elements in architecture and art. So, yeah, they really like that fleur de lis. The Catholic Church has used these three petals. Here again, we got the three again, right? The Catholic Church has used these three petals of the fleur de lis to symbolize the Holy Trinity: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So which is which? Who's the Holy Spirit? Who's the Son? Who's the Father? So, and the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Remember, we're in an inverted world. And although today most people think of France when they see the fleur de lis symbol, how the fleur de lis became a symbol of French royalty has been hotly debated for centuries. What is known is that this mysterious symbol was also used as a royal or a religious symbol by many ancient civilizations and cultures that predate France by thousands of years, or so the story says. It's even been linked to Mesopotamia and the Sumerian civilization, the oldest civilization known to mankind. The fleur de lis, which is a stylized lily, became, and they use those lilies at Easter too, became the central emblem of scouting through the influence of Robert Baden-Powell, founder of the scouting movement. When he created scouting in the early 1900s, he chose the symbol because it already had a long association with aviation and direction. On early maps and compasses, a fleur de lis was commonly used to mark north. Baden-Powell adopted the symbol to represent the idea that scouting should help guide young people in the right direction in life, just as a compass points north. This interpretation became part of official scouting explanations. In other words, I didn't just cook it up. They said it, right? Just like that pan deal. The scouting tradition, the three petals of the fleur de lis represent the three parts of the scout oath: duty to God and country, duty to help other people, duty to obey the scout law. This symbolic meaning appears in scouting manuals and training materials. It has appeared long before scouting, French royal, European coats of arms, medieval navigation charts. The symbol itself probably originated as a stylized iris or lily flower, which in European heraldry became associated with purity and guidance. When the Boy Scouts of America was established in 1910, it adopted the same emblem used in the original British Scouting movement. The American version added elements such as an eagle across a shield, two stars representing truth and knowledge, a shield symbolizing protection and preparedness. So, the fleur de lis in scouting represents guidance, like the north arrow on a compass, symbolizing the idea that scouting should help point young people toward the right path. So, bankruptcy, common among these groups. Bankruptcy is commonly used by institutions like Boy Scouts, Catholics, and the youth groups. And here's where it gets interesting. The average reporting delay is 20 to 30 years. So, of course, the Vatican always wanted to keep up with the times, introduced stricter rules in 2001, just 25 years ago, and later years requiring mandatory reporting to church authorities. Did you hear anything about cops? No, no. Mandatory reporting to church authorities, removal of credibly accused priests, cooperation with civil authorities in many countries. Many countries also enacted mandatory reporting laws for clergy, but they'll never do it on their own. Don't kid yourself. Researchers who analyzed the internal files released in litigation involving the Boy Scouts of America noticed a consistent pattern. Abuse reports often clustered around specific scouting activities that put boys in close contact with adult leaders or older youth without immediate supervision. The files themselves were not designed as statistical data sets, so exact percentages vary by study. But here's what they found. Common factors: sleeping in tents or cabins with leaders, nighttime supervision gaps, boys separated from parents for several days, limited outside oversight. Many survivors reported abuse late at night inside tents or cabins, or during situations where leaders claimed they were checking on scouts after the lights went out. Summer camps also concentrated large numbers of boys with rotating adult staff, which sometimes allowed offenders to move between troops or camps. Many scout skills are taught through individual mentoring with an adult badge counselor. Investigations noted that some cases occurred when a boy met alone with a counselor. Instruction happened in homes, garages, or remote camp areas. Counseling involved multiple meetings over time. Because merit badge counselors were often volunteers outside the troop leadership, oversight could be inconsistent. This structure unintentionally created situations where a single adult had repeated private access to a scout. And of course, transportation. Leaders driving a scout alone, long trips to camps or events, overnight travel stops. Cars created a setting where no other adults were present, and boys were dependent on the driver to reach home or camp. Kid, I'm not going to take you home, or I'm going to kill your parents if you tell anybody. Really, that's all they would have had to have said. Don't kid yourself. They're children, they're not many adults. That's why it takes a real coward to be a psychopath. Large later youth protection policies in scouting specifically address this by introducing two deep leadership rules and prohibitions on one transfer. Yeah, so what you do is you just get two pedophiles to join together, right? That solves a two people status. This is such a bunch of lies, all this stuff. Solving this is not going to happen. Some of these victims also think that, oh, we learned a lot. We should try to reconstruct this. No, burn it all down. You can't fix rotten evil. So, when lawyers and journalists reviewed thousands of case summaries from the BSA records, several structural factors appeared repeatedly. Isolation, activities created moments when a boy and adult were alone. Authority, leaders held strong trust and status. Camping, travel, and mentoring were seen as normal parts of the program. Boys often feared embarrassment or punishment, though these conditions allowed predators to blend abusive behaviors into legitimate activities. So then they came up with the things, and of course, I had to look to see anything in the records as far as cameras. Yes, in several major abuse scandals involving boys, especially the Boy Scouts of America, church institutions, and some boarding schools, court filings, and investigative reports do contain references to boys being photographed in sexual or compromising situations. In some cases, the photos were used for grooming, coercion, or blackmail. The documentation varies by case, but the pattern appears repeatedly once cameras became widely available in the 20th century. Scout leaders were taking nude photographs of the boys during camping trips or swimming activities. And here is where it gets really sicko. Leaders encourage boys to pose for fitness, medical, or artistic photos. Instances where photos were later used to intimidate boys into silence. Cameras became common in the 1930s to 1950s, and some abuse cases after that period involved photography. Survivors testified that predators sometimes threatened to show photos to parents or troop leaders if the boy reported the abuse. In abuse cases involving the Catholic Church and religious schools connected to institutions like the Catholic Church, there are documented incidents of priests taking Polaroids or film photograph of boys during abuse, clergy showing pornography and then photographing children, photos being kept as trophies or for exchange among offenders. Examples appear in court records in the US, Ireland, and Australia. One reason photography appears more frequently in these cases after the 1960s is technology. Polaroid cameras were introduced in 1948. Small cameras became cheap and portable by the 60s and 70s. So, yeah, they did use a lot of photos, but I couldn't find anything specific, but I found enough to indicate that, yes, of course they were using. Once cameras became common, some lawsuits and survivor testimonies do describe boys being photographed in compromising situations, and in certain cases, the images were used for coercion or intimidation. And they claim it's in a minority of the cases, but I really do not know. I would bet that it was prolific and everybody was taking. And here is the other thing, too. Do you realize boys were told to swim in the nude? Yes, you heard me right. When they went on all these little camping trips and stuff, they were photographing boys while naked during swimming activities and kept the images privately. So, while the files do not always explicitly describe blackmail, survivor testimony indicates fear of exposure was sometimes used to keep victims silent. So, scout leaders took nude photos of boys during camping trips. Boys were told the photos were for health, fitness, or documentation. So, yes, and they also got the boys to swim naked. this is just, I really sometimes I get at a loss for words. Rarely am I at a loss for words, but right now I am at a loss for words. So, yeah, they found a lot of cases of photography. Epstein, of course, is all about photography. So yeah, this is all. They're also blackmailing children, is what I'm trying to say here. So court records and investigations show that some abusers photograph boys during assaults or in compromising situations. Yeah, they got the boys to swim nude. How weird is all this stuff, right? How fucking sick is all this stuff? These people are predators. If anybody thinks it's okay, oh yeah, they've cleaned it up, they have new rules. Get your head out of the sand. They want the children, these sickos, these elites and church leaders. So how they hooked it was this way. Youth organizations historically required medical checkups before camp participation. Yeah. So, and what they did was this. Adult leaders were able to observe or single out boys while they were nude. Photography under the pretext of swim technique or training. Situations where boys were isolated during swim tests or instructions. So yeah, tell the boys they can't wear a swimming suit. They claim it was because it was not sanitary to wear a swimming suit. So they get all the boys nude so all these predators could take pictures. Yeah, that's exactly how it happened. Abusers claiming they were, excuse me, in several case files from scouting and church camps, abusers claiming they were conducting health inspections. Boys were told touching was part of a medical exam. Examinations occurred without a second adult present. This tactic appeared in multiple institution abuse investigations. So, and photography was widely encouraged. Scouting had a photography merit badge. Camp camps documented activities for newsletters and yearbooks. Leaders often brought cameras to record events. In most cases, this was harmless documentation, or so they say. But in abuse cases, investigators occasionally found that offenders used photography as a pretext to isolate boys, took photos during swimming or changing, and they kept the images privately. Some BSA reports describe leaders who collected photos of boys from camps or trips, which later became evidence during investigations. So this was proven, okay? So, authority, adults had questioned privacy, normalization, and of course, silence. Millions of boys participated in these programs. Most leaders and staff were not abusers, but we don't really know at this point. I looked to see if there was any drugging, and it appears that the drugging appears to be alcohol. Drugging does appear in some abuse case files, but is much less common in the documented records than grooming or coercion. Still, investigators in court testimony in several institutional abuse cases involving boys do describe situations where victims believed they had been given alcohol, sedatives, or other substances before assaults. So, from the internal records, I found these things: being given alcohol by scout leaders during camping trips, becoming very drowsy or disoriented before assault, waking up after being unconscious or heavily intoxicated. In most of these cases, the substance mentioned was alcohol because it was easy for adults to bring on camping trips. So, yeah, there are very few confirmed cases in those files involving chemical sedatives. But survivors sometimes described sudden sleepiness or confusion, suggesting the possibility of drugging in some situations. So, same thing as the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church gave boys wine, alcohol, or pills, used alcohol as part of grooming. assaulted boys after they became intoxicated or sedated. Yeah, these kids, these predators, they want to get these kids to really believe that they're in an actual relationship. Children can't consent to relationships. That is a sickness that comes out of these abusers. So yeah, I think abusers were using sleeping pills or tranquilizers because boys reported waking up during or after assaults. So can I prove it worldwide? Well, no, of course not. And of course, in Jeffrey Epstein, everybody's given alcohol and drugs and all kinds of stuff. So these people themselves take all these drugs and stuff. So to think that they wouldn't give it to children is kind of misguided, I would have to say. So why drugging is rarely documented in older cases? Researchers studying institutional abuse point to several reasons. Lack of forensic testings. Most abuse cases occurred decades before routine toxicology was able to be tested. The victims were children. Children often could not identify substances they were given. The evidence disappears quickly. Many drugs leave the body within hours. Grooming was usually easier. Predators often relied on trust, authority, or intimidation rather than chemicals. Because of this, drugging is probably underreported, but is not the dominant pattern in most of these cases. So some do report cases. I don't think really much is really known, but they do know that 60 to 70% of scout troops historically were chartered by religious organizations. So, and some of the companies that sponsored these kids were ExxonMobil, AT&T, Ford Motor Company, General Electric, JP Chase. So corporate executives often served on local BSA councils or national advisory things. So yeah, the elites got themselves on all these councils, right? Another large share of troops were sponsored by local civics groups, such as the Rotary International, Lions Club International, American Legion, Kiwanis International. These groups often recruited adult leaders and helped fund local programs. So you see how this thing got all mashed up? So, scouting also had unusually strong recognition from the U.S. government. The organization received a federal charter from the U.S. Congress in 1916 through the United States Congress. This charter gave the organization a kind of official national endorsement, which reinforced its reputation as a trusted civic institution. Another layer that became important later involved insurance and liability systems. Large insurance companies covered many scouting activities, including Hartford Financial Services, Century Indemnity Company. When abuse laws expanded decades later, these insurers became central to settlement negotiations in the BSA bankruptcy case. Researchers often point out that the organizations sat at the intersection of four powerful pillars: religion, business, civic organization, and government legitimacy. Because of that structure, complaints against leaders sometimes had to pass through layers of respected institutions, which made allegations harder to challenge socially. For generations, parents trusted the Boy Scouts with their sons, but inside the organization, leaders kept a hidden archive, files documenting men accused of abusing boys. The records proved something disturbing. The problem wasn't unknown, it was thoroughly documented. And let me run down the dates. 1910, Boy Scouts of America founded in the USA. 1920 to 1940s, internal records begin documenting leaders accused of sexual misconduct. The organization starts maintaining confidential files on suspected abusers. 1960s to 1980s, the internal ineligible volunteer files expand significantly as reports of abuse increase. Instead of consistently reporting accusations to law enforcement, many cases are handled internally and individuals are quietly removed or reassigned. 1985, a confidential internal Boy Scouts memo warns that the organization could face major liability if abuse cases become public. 1991, the Washington Times Scouts Honor investigation exposes the existence of the internal abuse files. This is one of the first major national media investigations into the issue. 1991. A lot of years after that, right? 2007, a civil lawsuit in Oregon begins pushing for the release of internal Boy Scouts abuse files. 2010, an Oregon jury awards damages to abuse survivor Carrie Lewis, leading to the public release of thousands of pages of internal documentation. 2012, court orders release of approximately 20,000 pages of internal Boy Scout files covering abuse allegations between 1965 and 1985. The documents confirm that the organization maintained confidential files on suspected abusers for decades. 2019, multiple states opened what they called look back windows, allowing victims of childhood sexual abuse to file lawsuits regardless of statute of limitations. Large numbers of claims against the Boy Scouts begin to emerge. And I want to point something out too. They did that look back window, right? When they said we're going to remove the statute of limitations. Well, and when I was listening to 1,000 new cases and stuff, I discovered this. If you were in a state that had the statute of limitations on your case, okay, they said they had the look back window to get rid of that stuff, right? But when they came to the settlement, if you had your abuse occur in a state that had statutes of limitation, you got paid less money for your claim. They just can't stop abusing the victims is the deal here. So yeah, the fund is way underfunded. They're messing with the people who live in certain states because of these it's just insane. But anyway, so 2020 to 2021, more than 82,000 sexual abuse claims are filed in the bankruptcy proceedings. This becomes one of the largest sex abuse cases in U.S. history. September 2022, a federal judge approves a $2.46 billion settlement plan, creating a compensation trust for survivors. The settlement is one of the largest sexual abuse settlements ever reached in the United States. But the truth will never be known. In institutions like the Boy Scouts and the Catholic Church, the official numbers are a floor, not a ceiling, because many survivors never disclose, or they disclose decades later, or they died before reporting. The CDC explicitly notes that many children wait to report sex abuse or never report at all. So reported counts understate the real burden. So for the Boy Scouts alone, about 82,500 abuse claims were filed in bankruptcy, and the settlement will be 2.46 billion. Yeah, same thing. I got the Catholic Church down below if you want to take a look at all that. But yeah, so here's the patterns. 1920s, organizations already documenting abuse internally. 1940s to the 80s, thousands of cases accumulate quietly. 1991, first major national investigation. 2010 to 2012, courts force internal records public. 2019 to 2020, scale becomes undeniable. 2020 to 2022, bankruptcy and massive settlement. And I'm going to read you this short story here. Michael Johnson first learned about the ineligible volunteer files on day one of his time with the Boy Scouts of America. Michael Johnson was hired in 2010 as the organization's first youth protection officer. Johnson, a longtime criminal investigator from Plano, Texas, who specialized in sex crimes, was tasked with recommending policies to keep its million members safe from sexual abuse by scoutmasters, adult volunteers, or fellow scouts. The Boy Scouts, now known as Scouts BSA, had long failed to do this. The ineligible volunteer files, also known as the perversion files or P files, were a private set of documents containing the names of known sexual abusers within the organization, dating back to at least 1919. Evidence that the Boy Scouts, an institution associated with Rockwellian harmony and explicitity based in the ideal of leadership and courage, has long been aware of its unique vulnerabilities to sexual abuse. Johnson attempted to address these vulnerabilities, namely the low barriers to entry for volunteering and the unsupervised overnight trips. But he kept running into barriers, either from higher ups at the Boy Scouts of America, headquartered in Irving, Texas, or its religious partners, the Catholic Church and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, better known as the Mormon Church, which severed ties with the Scouts in 2018 after it began admitting female, transgender, and gay use. Early in his tenure, Johnson asked for a standard of care document and was told there wasn't one, even though the Scouts had officially advised on youth serving organization standards of care for the CDC. The institution, he concluded, came first. It's a beautiful brand. BSA conjures up parades and apple pie, the American flag, and all that, Johnson said in Scouts Honor, The Secret Files of the Boy Scouts of America, a new Netflix documentary. A youth protection officer, Johnson says he was primarily expected to market the image of safety. The Scouts were aware that safety was a real problem for its young members. As the 94-minute documentary recounts, through interviews with survivors, investigative journalists, and experts on the archival record, there were numerous instances in which the P file names simply moved towns and volunteered with the Scouts again. The patterns of abuse stretch back decades. Survivors of every generation, millennials, Gen X, Boomer, recount their experiences and the punishing burden of shame. When the Boy Scouts of America filed for bankruptcy protection in the 2020 after several states changed their civil statutes of limitation for sex crimes and thus opened a flood of potential litigation, the organization established a trust for compensation to victims of sexual abuse. Some 82,209 men filed complaint claims, the largest case of child sex abuse involving a single organization in U.S. history. This was absolutely staggering. Many orders of magnitude more claims came forward against the Boy Scouts that ever came forward against the Catholic Church, said the film's director, Brian Kapniker. I just felt like this had to be directly addressed head on in a longer format than the short film he was working on prior to the bankruptcy. The BSA has since exited bankruptcy, and it is in the process of working through a $2.46 billion settlement with the claimants. Johnson, meanwhile, has emerged as a whistleblower, publicly calling on the Scouts to institute more changes beyond compensation and for a congressional investigation into the organization. 82 8,200,000, that's the ones that came forward, he told The Guardian. Is this something that America wants to have a better understanding of? Why so many? What happened? And what needs to take place to stop this from happening? Scouts Honor outlines the numerous ways Scouts are particularly vulnerable to abuse. Prior to 2010, there was almost no screening of potential volunteers. Scouting was an ideal pursuit from an abuser, a rotating supply of young boys, unsupervised overnight visits, a code of silence. As Patrick Boyle, a journalist who first began investigating sexual abuse cover ups within the Boy Scouts in 1986, puts it in the film, they had essentially a product defect they were ignoring. And it was that this organization was built in a way that molesters could get in, abuse kids, and get away with it. Many abusers were respected community figures, church leaders, or adults trusted by their family. The incentives to speak up were low, the risk of destabilizing betrayal high. Add to the stigma of male sexual abuse and the organization's rampant homophobia. The organization said homosexuality was inconsistent with the obligations in the Scout Oath and Scout Law from its founding and only opened up its ranks to gay members in 2013. And you have a recipe for silence and shame. For several survivors, the film was the first time they ever spoke of their abuse, even to their own families. That's how profound the stigma is, said Kappenberger. Numerous participants spoke of lifelong anger, a shame at being marked, an inability to move past a defining incident. You disassociate, said Doug Kennedy, who was assaulted by a Scouts camp director during an overnight excursion. What happened to me took something away. It's a moment in time that's burned into my head. The Boy Scouts have maintained that the changes implemented in recent years have fixed the problem. The organization's website claims that safety is a value that must be taught and reinforced at every opportunity. We're here is where you got to start fighting this inclusive language, okay? And I'm keep reading. It says we're all responsible and must hold each other accountable to provide a safe environment for all participants and lists such protections as mandatory youth protection training, criminal background checks, banning one on one youth adult interaction, mandatory reporting of suspected abuse to law enforcement, and a volunteer screening database. Johnson maintains that this is not enough, pointing to the lack of a government ID requirement for volunteers or a hotline, which studies indicate is a preferred method for Gen Z reporting abuse. This is not the first time the Boy Scouts have been sued or had investigative journalists look at sex abuse within their organization, and it has not created the needed changes to ensure the children are safe, he said. It is attainable. The Boy Scouts of America just refuses to do it. The film also calls out the organization's deflection of responsibility, embodied by Steve McGowan, the Boy Scouts General Counsel from 2013 until 2022, who participated in the film and maintains that the Boy Scout is merely a microcosm of society in which abuse occurs, and it is impossible to pre screen everyone. Boy, that's a crazy statement, right? It's a dangerous deflection, says Kappenberger. Number one, it ignores the obvious. 82,000 people came forward. No, this isn't like other scandals. This is vastly worse than other scandals. To look at a bankruptcy in which 82,000 people came forward and say, this is just part of society at large, it's wrong. It's incorrect, he added. This is an institution that we hold up as moral leaders, that we say are going to teach our kids to be moral leaders. But when they had the choice about whether they're going to do the right thing, they did the wrong thing over and over and over again. That's what the files show. And I think that's what this latest rehashing of the same message is continuing to show. Though the film calls for reform and for a congressional investigation, it needs to happen for the Boy Scouts to have any integrity to move forward, says Kappenberger. The ending note belongs to the survivors. The embarrassment, the shame, the years of anger and silence, the loved ones who were never told, never given a chance to respond with grace. For some, the suicidal ideation, the remembrance of friends lost to these demons, and then the catharsis of coming forward, of telling one story. We can get angry at the Boy Scouts and we can try to call for change, but we do have to remember that there is a deep, deep courage that comes from being able to tell this story. It all springs from that courage. For over a century, Government run and church boarding schools in the United States also remove Native children. The United States has a very long, long history of all of this. I have all of the history of all this down below. None of this is new. None of it. Sexual abuse of boys in these schools also included the teachers, the missionaries, and all of that. It is just an unbelievable s- slot onslaught that these boys have endured, and yet everybody is silent. They're freaking out over girls getting raped. Let's start freaking out over these boys getting raped. I'll be back on the other side. Okay, I'm going to be wrapping this up. I have a couple more segments to go, but I'm trying my best. I really have this mission to put all this into one file because I do not want to break it up. Okay, so actually, so during the abuse of boys, 1870 to the year 2000, four major youth systems side by side that I put on this list here. We had the Indian boarding schools; those boys were raped also. Catholic organization, orphanages, and reform schools. We had the Boy Scouts, juvenile reformatories, and cadet institutions. When mapped together, these same decades repeat roughly from the 1880s to the 1980s. Yeah, it all started with those native schools and stuff when the boys started getting abused. So I'm not going to go over them all over again. I would hope that you would want to read about all of this because it's a lot to take in just a couple of hours of me yapping. So anyway, so yeah, it's basically these kids are being set up to be raped is basically what it is. And I have to say that I consider this all a setup. Now you're going to have to decide for yourself. Do you think this stuff just magically happened? These boys were just innocent little victims and these scout people were just like heroes or everything's going to be okay? I got to tell you something. Everything's not going to be okay. Nothing was ever okay. People just happened to believe it was okay, right? That is the difference is people back then believed that things were okay. And they also had this strong, strong reliance on the government to tell them when things weren't okay. Just because, for example, I did a show about Spain and those 300,000 stolen children. Well, I traced those children and come to find out, when my dad was stationed in Spain, come to find out, everybody knew Spain was dangerous during that time. Franco was still ruling Spain. Over 300,000 children were stolen during that time. And during that time, our parents were very naive. They trusted the government, right? I looked into all the records. I could not find any time that the U.S. military warned any families. So we were relocated to Spain during the era that more children were being abducted than any place else in the world. Over 300,000 kids were going missing. My dad gets stationed in Spain. They built the base there. The U.S. military built that base that we moved to. They paid for it with our tax dollars. We lived there. It was highly dangerous. And not a word was said to our parents. No military people got any kind of notice that anything was a bit sketchy in Spain during that time. And that was the first time that I actually can tie Opus Dei to the stealing of the children and during that time in Spain. So, yeah, people used to believe that, well, if there was something wrong, it wouldn't be on the shelves for me to buy it. Or if something was outrageously wrong, the government would have fixed it, right? So, we had very simple kind of thinking, right? Because I would hope that if my parents had received those warnings, I mean, we were in Spain. I was 9 years old to 12 years old. The place where we lived was base housing outside of Madrid. We had to hop on a bus, like a regular Madrid bus, to get into town, and about 20-minute drive or something on a bus. So, as 9 and 10-year-old kids, we would hop on a bus. We would go into Madrid. We'd cruise around. We'd go shopping. We'd go to movies and stuff, all on our own. No adults present. No adults ever anywhere. And I would hope to believe that if my parents were warned, they might have curbed some of our activities, right? But no, nothing got curbed because nobody was told, because people used to actually believe in the government. So, and one other thing I'll cover before I close off here is they also had Hitler youth camps in America, 1935 to 1941. There's footage of Hitler youth camps in America. So yeah, they claim that. Over 110 million boys have been members of the Boy Scouts of America since 1910. And that includes the Boy Scouts, the Cub Scouts, and the Explorer Scouts. So, um, at its peak, it was getting about 4 to 5 million youth members per year. Now, I don't think those parents would have let those kids show up there if they had any inclination at all of what was really going on. And then what happened with the girls, this is a good part. The girls were basically sent out to sell cookies. I was a brownie when I was a kid. They called the young girls brownies. I only know this because there's a picture of myself with a brownie uniform. I have no memory of most of my childhood, but so obviously I was a brownie, and that's the funny thing because they always name us after their own people because the brownists were the people who left the UK and then headed to the Netherlands. That's where I picked up the trail on them years ago. So yeah, they called the junior Girl Scout, they called us brownies. And that was for ages 7 to 10. So yeah, all those kids, yeah, millions of kids per year. So this was not just some little innocent thing. And it was because it was a different era. So I have to ask you now, what's going to happen moving forward? Are people going to say, well, yeah, they fix things. It's okay. Let's just send them to the camp. Or are they going to really believe that this stuff can't be fixed, right? So here is why many victims never appear in records. Research on child abuse consistently finds several barriers to reporting: shame and stigma, fear of not being believed, loyalty to the institution, legal deadlines that once blocked lawsuits. Because of these factors, the full number of victims in any large institution is almost impossible to measure entirely. So, yeah, over 110 million boys participated in the Boy Scouts over the past century. And so, of 110 million, 82,000 abuse cases, pretty low percentage, I would have to say. But remember, most people did not file. I don't know how many of these 82,000 didn't file, but a lot. So, of course, um, and then his wife, that young woman, came from a wealthy family. Yeah, this is all an elite operation. Full stop. I don't think I have much more to say. I do have to come back for another segment here. Uh, so and the Girl Scouts, yeah, the Girl Scouts really got it. They were sent out on street corners to sell cookies. So yeah, um, and that's a huge money maker deal, right? Those Girl Scouts going out and making cookies and stuff. So yeah, I'm gonna close this section off right now. When I return, I'm hoping to finish the file. My goal is to finish it in one file. So yeah, the Girl Scouts. Yeah, I'll get back into that if I'm able to when I come back. But yeah, the Girl Scout cookie program is big business, worth about 800 million in annual sales. Yeah, the Girl Scout cookies were introduced over 100 years ago. So yeah, the cookie names and stuff are all sketchy too, right? So yeah, the Girl Scouts hung out on street corners selling cookies, and the boys were hanging out in tents, having horrible times, and nobody believed them. Um, Even the kids that tried to tell, everybody said that couldn't have happened. The Boy Scouts is a fine organization. They wouldn't let this happen to my son. We just wouldn't let this happen at all. When in fact it did happen. So I'll be back on the other side. Okay, the new group, the World Organization of the Scouting Movement, reports that its member organization represents tens of millions of young people in more than 170 countries. Combined with Girl Scouting groups through the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts, the movement continues to reach a large global population. So, what began as a small experiment with a group of boys on an English island in 1907 evolved into a global youth movement operating in most countries in the world. The structure of small patrol groups, outdoor activities, and youth leadership proved easy to adapt across cultures and societies. So yes, I looked up to see who had allegations. The Scouting Association, the UK, yeah, they've had lots of allegations. Canada, they've all had allegations. I've got them all listed for you to take a look yourself. Um, Abuse scandals involving youth leaders have occurred in multiple countries, not just the United States. The issues often reflect broader structural risks present in large youth organizations, especially those relying heavily on volunteers and overnight activities. And I did look, I couldn't find, was the Hitler Youth Group modeled on the Boy Scouts? And there are real structural similarities between scouting movements and the Hitler Youth, but historians generally explain them in a more nuanced way than saying the Nazi program was simply copied from the Boy Scouts of America or British Scouting. So let me see. The only exception for a while were groups run by the Catholic Church. Let me see. Adolf Hitler had negotiated an agreement with the Catholic Church because many high ranking Nazis were Catholics. The agreement allowed the church to continue to operate their youth groups even as others were forced to shut down. In fact, many Hitler youth served as altar boys, wearing their uniforms under their robes. So, yeah, I would say they probably were connected to the Boy Scouts because Hitler was also, well, I've got a whole thing, that whole thing with Hitler and Austria and all that stuff over there. Yeah, Hitler would have known about all this stuff. But as noted by history, the Nazis officially banned the Boy Scouts in 1936 as part of their effort to force every kid in Germany into the Hitler Youth and blah, blah, blah. So I don't really know the answer. Were the Hitler Youth really Boy Scouts? Probably. I would say probably. Because these people aren't exactly clever or smart. They're just evil, right? So whenever they can just kind of make something exactly the same as the other thing, they're going to pick that route because they're not that smart and they're not that clever. So they're just going to pick the route that's the easiest and the most evil, right? So, yeah, I won't be able to solve this question if they did originate from there or not. My instincts would be to say yes. I also have down below, I gathered up all the known pedophile name groups. Not all of them are current, but we have a lot of them that NAMBLA, North American Man Boy Love Association, and there's a whole group of them. Um, there's a group called Pedophiles Anonymous or PAN. Then the Pedophile Information Exchange, I talked about them last. So, yeah, there's a whole group of them I have listed down below. And most of them were elite foundations. NAMBLA was founded in 1978 in Boston. It held its first conference in the same year. So, yeah, a lot of these groups are gone now, but I just thought, well, I would just document which ones they were. So if you run across any of these groups, you might be able to take a look at them. So I would have to say that individual cases involving clergy abuse were reported in newspapers as early as the 1950s to 80s, but then, of course, it took years and years until the Boston Globe came along and did all that stuff about those priests and stuff. And that stuff is still out there, right? And then we have Epstein and all that stuff. So the abuse is just rolling along as long as people just sit and let it happen, as long as people feed them the children. Um, I would have to say that nothing has changed. Do you think that they all of a sudden have decided they don't want to lust after children or rape children, that things are changing? It would take a very foolish person to really believe that one, if you ask me. So, yeah, I would have to say that this has been going on since the very beginning. And I also did a much, much deeper dive into where was the first noted case of elites and the churches. And it goes back further than this, and it's a subject for another day. So, yeah, it has all been, at least it appears to me, under elite control. Because here's another elite control. this Boyce person that I mentioned at the very beginning, the newspaper guy in Chicago. Remember, Chicago was where all the Ashkenazi Jews wound up, right? And the mafia and all that stuff. Well, I was able to trace William D. Boyce, the guy in Chicago, the newspaper guy who fanned out this whole Boy Scout thing. Well, he, of course, I found he came through German ancestry through intermarriage. So yeah, he became a major newspaper publisher in Chicago. Chicago was one of the fastest growing cities, and of course, he was a big push. Um, so he really put the word out on all of these Boy Scout things in the country and spread it out all through the the news and stuff. So, um, and he ties to all these other groups of Freemasons, the Shriners, and all that. So, yeah. So what they did was during the Progressive Era, 1890s and 1920s, wealthy Chicago figures often funded social reform programs like the Boy Scouts and stuff. So, and Freemasons and Shriners also had different structures for the boys and stuff. So, yeah, in Chicago, that should set off your first alarm when you hear somebody from Chicago, because that's where the root of all this stuff got started, right? Because after William D. Boyce incorporated the Boy Scouts of America in 1910, control of the organization quickly shifted to a group of powerful businessmen, reformers, and political figures. I mean, there was FDR, Theodore Roosevelt was involved. He became the first honorary president of the Boy Scouts of America, Teddy Roosevelt. Um, so yeah, it has been 100%. I don't think I need to beat this drum any farther, but it has been 100% church and elite driven. And that, my friends, tells me a whole lot. Tells me a whole lot. And it's always been this way. It's not like they always want to pass it off like it's been going on for thousands of years. Nothing we can do to stop this raping of children. We just can't do anything about it. Well, the problem is the same people that are doing the raping of the children are still the same people that are running things today, right? So unless people make a decision that we're no longer going to be ruled by people who like to rape, murder, and kill children, then things are not going to change. As long as people want to sit all day long talking about Meghan and Harry and if they're going to get divorced or not and all this stuff and everything that's going on, and you take your eyes off the children, I don't have any way to tell you that, oh, it's going to get better. Don't worry. You know, this show I just talked about, all this stuff. Yeah, that was all in the past. Everything's going to change. What I'm trying to show you is historically, through their own words, their own actions, these people are the very same people that have created this lust for children, perpetuated it, and it is still going on today. The United States remains the largest trafficker in the entire world. So, along with everybody yelling, the United States is a big, powerful, richest country in the world, well, I would stop bragging so much about that stuff until all of this deal with children gets put into place. So, what if this country has a lot of money and so called a lot of power? It is, in fact, a satanic nation. Can you think of any other thing to call this place? I have thought and thought and thought. This country is ruled by satanic beliefs, and it has been since the day one. And if you don't believe me, just go tune in yourself. They're spewing all this stuff about the end times. Jesus is coming back. We're waiting for Jesus. Yeah, all this waiting for Jesus BS. And yeah, they're really talking about the end times and they're going to, well, you got to write a story, right? You got to have a good script for your maniacs to follow. So somebody along the way, one of the main elites, they wrote this script. And the loser elites that are running things right now are the ones driving this script. So you want to wonder how this script is going to turn out with these drug-addled people all in charge of things? Hey, who knows? Fortunately, I will probably be dead before it all happens, but hey, just keep in mind, I am just the canary in the coal mine. What they're doing to me, they also want to do to the rest of you. So please hear what I am saying. Do not use your heat and your electricity and all that air conditioning coming up. It is further damaging your system. And no, you don't need to take your kids to a Boy Scouts of America. Can't you figure out a way to go gather up some kids in the neighborhood to play sports with them? Do you need this big, violent, sexually orientated group to do the thing around kids? Of course not. It has been the plot all along. Yeah, sure, they can say, oh, it was an elite thing. We wanted to help these kids become better citizens. No, in my mind, in looking at all of this, I have spent a lot of time on this. I've looked at it from every single angle. I cannot find a single thing inside of me that says that there is anything good about this that should be helped, saved, or continue on. I'm going to put this on hold for a second. So they claim that today many youth serving organizations use mandatory reporting laws, national background checks, centralized offender registries, independent oversight bodies. So if you trust these people with your children, then good luck is all I have to say to you, because I really doubt that any of these things have been taken seriously. I really have to doubt that, because to me it appears like it was kind of a plot from the very beginning, right? So it just seems to me that this is something that is so evil and so tragic that I can't see any way that people should say, well, let's rebuild it. Kids need some place to go. No, they don't. Kids need to be with their families and their parents and close people that they know about. And remember, that close group includes Boy Scouts. So if you've got rot in your own family, that means you've got predators around these kids to begin with. That means you make it much worse when you send them to these camps and stuff, because by the time they get abused the first time, they do not know that it's abuse, right? So the trick has been in for a very long time. As far as I can tell, for more than a century, the evidence sat in their very own files, names, reports, and warnings. They knew who the predators were. They wrote their names down, and they left the boys there anyways. This isn't a story about a few bad men. It's about an institution that documented abuse and chose to protect itself instead of the children in its care. Parents were promised honor, leadership, and safety. What the Boy Scouts built instead was a system that tracked predators and quietly moved them. And when an organization knows a danger, records it, and still allows it to continue, this isn't ignorance. That was a decision. And keep in mind, the victims all came away feeling shame. The victims today still feel shame. Let's end this shame game today. Let's stand in solidarity with these victims. You're probably sitting next to somebody who was victimized themselves. Do you know anything about them? Do you know where they got some of these things that you consider weird from? Have you ever talked to them about their past? They don't report for 30 or more years. So it is possible that we are surrounded by other abuse victims. It is time to end this shame game. None of this was ever funny. This was real children getting abused by real adults who should have been honoring them and caring for them. But instead, the opposite happened. And all we can do at this point is get out of their systems. Stop putting your children in those chairs to be photographed for pictures for school albums and all of that. Stop putting your children on social media. It has to stop with the adults. These are children. They're not many adults. Be safe out there, and goodbye.